This is the scene in Westminster, where in just over an hour the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, will deliver what's almost certainly his last budget before the general election. We're with you until 3:30 this afternoon. This is Politics Live. With me in the studio now, the BBC's economics editor, Faisal Islam, and political editor, Chris Mason. And I'll be joined later by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and her Labour shadow. We'll hear from the SNP and the Liberal Democrats, plus expert analysis and reaction from the financial markets.
Is this an election-winning budget? Is this really a turning point, Chancellor?
And there is Jeremy Hunt with his Treasury team, all gathering in that traditional photo call, holding up in just a moment that red box, the traditional red box inside which is his budget, which he will unveil shortly in the House of Commons. But could today be a repeat of last year's autumn statement?
I'm going to go further and cut the main rate of employee national insurance by 2 percentage points from 12% to 10%.
Another 2p cut in national insurance is widely expected today. But could there be more? But with money tight in the midst of a recession, those giveaways are likely to be paid for by spending cuts and tax rises elsewhere. And with a general election imminent, how will the budget go down beyond Westminster?
I'm in Newcastle, hearing from local businesses and community leaders about what they want from the budget and getting their reaction to what the Chancellor announces.
Yes, it's budget day. The day has finally arrived. One of the few remaining set pieces where the government gets the opportunity to set out its agenda before the general election, whenever that happens. We'll talk about speculation on a date later on in the programme. It'll be important to hear how the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, presents the decisions that he makes today, because we've heard quite a lot about what's going to be in this budget. Let's give you a flavour of that on some of the front pages. The Times, Jeremy Hunt seeks to win over voters with £900 tax cut, a combination of 2p cut in national insurance now and in the autumn when he announced it. Jeremy Hunt, The Guardian, says defies public services alarm with pre-election budget tax cuts. This is the Financial Times. Hunt to put £10 billion tax cut, that's the cost, at core of budget as Tories eye tough election. And finally, The Telegraph. Tax cuts spark election talk. As I say, we'll certainly get into that in just a moment. Well, those are the headlines today. Chris and Faisal, there has, as always, been endless speculation and reports about particularly the issue of tax cuts and how far the Chancellor would go. It's certainly been obsessing Conservative MPs on this programme over the past few months. But it looks as if that cut is going to happen. What would you guess at tomorrow's headlines being once he has announced this budget, Chris?
They are likely to be, It's a good question, that. It's interesting to ponder what Jeremy Hunt would hope those headlines are versus what they turn out to be, not least because he's had a fair smattering of headlines, as you were just reflecting this morning, which could be, if you'd landed from another planet, that the paper's the day after a budget rather than the day of a budget. But given that we have been reporting since yesterday, what is a substantial tax cut with this 2p from national insurance. The intriguing thing for me is there any scope for something else around the whole question of a tax for workers? So Labour are saying, they've done some number crunching. They reckon that his room for manoeuvre might be a little greater than he's been letting on. Does that allow an extra penny somewhere else, potentially on income tax? The argument that others make in government is no, that isn't, in their judgment, their choice, affordable, and therefore maybe instead there's talk of that being a prospect down the track, either in another quote-unquote fiscal event before an election or something that the Conservatives talk about in terms of a manifesto.
And is that because the 2p cut that he announced, we heard there in the autumn statement that has only really just come in, that cut to national insurance that we've already had, hasn't moved the dial for them?
It hasn't moved the dial, so there's a fear amongst Conservative MPs that whatever they do now, a substantial chunk of the electorate are simply not listening. Now, you might argue that if you can't move the dial much with 2p, maybe you can if it's a combined 4p on national insurance. And there's a counter-argument that says it might not have moved the dial in a positive sense for the Conservatives, but maybe the dial would be more negative if it hadn't happened. And therefore, maybe it did move the dial, it just left the dial where it was as opposed to it slipping sort of more negatively. They're going to make a broader argument that says, look, this shows where our instincts lie.
Yeah,
this is what we aspire to do when we judge the conditions allow it to happen.
What's the message, broadly, that Jeremy Hunt will want to get across today, which may be reflected in tomorrow's papers?
Well, I'm very struck by the use of this word, as we expect, of the phrase, I should say, turning point. Because actually, that conversation you just had with Chris kind of gets to that, which is 2p didn't move the dial, but 4p, you start to kind of get further along the curve of a turning point of taxes, which, let's be clear, have gone up substantially.
Yeah.
Accompanying a bigger state, which the Conservatives say was not our instincts, but was a necessity as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the energy shock from the Russia invasion of Ukraine. We have a bigger state, we have higher taxes. We're starting to turn that around.
Right.
So that's the message on taxes, but then in the backdrop, the message, which is tougher, particularly because of the move into recession, is that the economy has started to turn too. And there's all sorts of arguments there about how much people will feel that, how much they'll give credit to the government, how much they'll blame global factors versus whoever happens to be in government.
Well, and you mentioned recession. Not an ideal backdrop, I'd put to you, for any Chancellor to be unveiling a financial statement, a budget. Let's just show our viewers this graph, because it's titled Economic Growth Since Rishi Sunak Became Prime Minister. Of course, he was Chancellor before that. And you can see there, since 2022, the end of 2022, I mean, economic growth has been bumping pretty well along the bottom. But crucially, and importantly, those last two quarters of 2023, Q3, Q4, it drops into negative growth. And of course, the definition is that if you have two consecutive quarters of negative growth, it's a recession. Difficult to see how you sell a turning point when we're in recession.
Yes, I mean, presentation, extremely difficult for the government to say that. The bigger picture, as you showed in that chart, is zero. And if what we had at the end of last year is only a technical recession, just a dip into recession, and the flip side of that is we've only had technical growth, really, and that's going to continue for the next couple of quarters. We may well already be out of this recession, but this flat picture makes you susceptible to these dips into recession. And in general, that flat picture is what the Chancellor says he's going to try to deal with a tax cut focused on workers, and becomes one of the key background arguments for the election.
Yeah.
What the opposition plans for growth would be too. Well,
and of course we'll get to that with both a minister and shadow minister. The question at the heart of this, which is the old Ronald Reagan question, is do you feel better off? Do people feel better off after 14 years of Conservative governments, or even just the last year or so? Now, the reason they might not is because of what's happened to inflation. And again, we can show viewers the inflation consumer prices index. If we take you back to 2021, look at the figure there, 0.7% at the beginning of 21. And of course, for the reasons we know, a pandemic, a war in Ukraine, the energy shock, in part has contributed to this whopping rise in inflation, which peaked in October 2022 at 11.1%. It's come down quite substantially to 4% in January, the target being 2%. Now, this, of course, is the rate of inflation.
No, I think it is important to note that is a turning point, because in previous experiences of double-digit inflation, it has lasted for a year or two. There's a point I made when it reached 10%, and it hasn't this time. Now, how much credit goes to the government versus the Bank of England versus the general?
We always like to say they take credit when it comes down and, of course, distance themselves when it goes up.
That's a matter for the electorate. But it wasn't preordained that 11% would come down. There are global factors, as you rightly point out, on the downside. But if you're going to have the disbenefit of having the blame for it hitting 11%, maybe there's some soupçon of benefit you get for having gone down.
Except, do people feel better off? Because prices are still rising. They're rising in the main, albeit more slowly, because we can show, though, look at these three sort of important key fundamentals. Since 21 and 24, over the last 3 years, 20% increase in clothing, 31% increase in food, and food inflation has been particularly stubborn, and because of that energy shock, 90% increase in energy. Will people feel better off?
Probably not, is the truth. So people will feel all of the things that these charts reveal, that you have a situation where the tax burden has been through the roof, where the cost of living is significant, and that backdrop is sufficiently dominant that it's incredibly difficult for a Chancellor, and even a couple of quote-unquote fiscal events, as Westminster likes to call them, autumn statements, budgets, to fundamentally shift that bigger picture. Instead, they can try and point to a direction of travel, both economically and politically, which I think we'll get quite a lot of from the Chancellor at lunchtime, as we did in the autumn. But that backdrop is so significant because the events that shaped it, as Faisal was talking about, have been so significant, whether it's the pandemic or the war in Ukraine, or indeed, as we saw, politically, all of the stuff around Liz Truss's tenure in government, that shifting that economic and political backdrop for Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt is incredibly difficult.
I actually put this question directly to the Chancellor on the day of the growth figures when the recession was confirmed. He said something quite interesting. He pushed further. He's normally very careful when he's talking about the Bank of England. But he said to me, I don't know the direct quote, but it was something like the turning point will come when the Bank of England start to cut interest rates. Okay, which is a bit of a nudge there. As I said, he's normally careful. Now, what's happened is, as well as the chart you showed showing all the different kind of commodities prices, obviously mortgage costs have gone up significantly. And we're talking hundreds of pounds per month. Now, that is an extraordinary amount.
Well,
Context here, our national insurance cuts, even if you add both of them together, we're talking £90 a month.
Yes.
Now, that is noticeable on hundreds of pounds a month. Non-negligible, I would say, but it's still, you weigh that up, but it's almost like they're waiting for the Bank of England to cut, to kind of confirm to the nation that we have turned a corner.
Is there any indication of when that might be? People have talked about June, the sort of summertime, which could, of course, be another factor in when the election may be called, but that would be an important moment.
Despite the fact, as you showed, inflation is coming to target, the mood music we get from them is that they're just waiting to be absolutely sure that inflation hasn't spread everywhere and isn't more enduring. So.
And inflation, of course, cutting it. We've just seen Rishi Sunak there leaving number 10 on his way, making that short journey to the Palace of Westminster there.
Curiously, the Prime Minister seems to have managed to leave the front door without incident. I was in Downing Street about half an hour ago, Joe, and the Chancellor came out to do his famous moment with the raising of the red box and his team of ministers. And the car was there just down the street, his snappers waiting to get the moment of the Chancellor walking with his red box to the Range Rover, get in it and head off. And he turned round and went back into number 11, stood with his nose pressed against the door for a few seconds. Well, I don't know, had he left the gas on? I don't know. Then had to knock on his own front door, went back in.
Oh, they didn't let him in then immediately?
No, and then 30 seconds later emerged out of number 10.
Well, of course, it's convenient, isn't it, that you can move seamlessly from number 11 to
I like on these days of high choreography that you get splashes of absurdity, as well as all of the, the numbers and all the rest of it that we're going to get shortly.
Well, and high drama. And actually, just on a point on Rishi Sunak, because, of course, he was former Chancellor, and Jeremy Hunt, and how closely they've worked together on this particular budget. The tension in terms of perhaps how far to go in terms of any tax cuts, whether they're right or wrong.
When you have a Prime Minister who, when he was campaigning to be Prime Minister, talked about a desire to cut income tax. Now, cutting income tax, you speak to loads of Conservative MPs, say that makes for a better headline, it's more instantly understandable. The catch is it's more expensive, and there's the danger that it might be inflationary as well. So, that tussle, that juggle has been going on, and we'll see the extent to which it plays out, both in what is announced today, but then it might also be trailed for the future, in an hour or so.
Well, that is the scene and all the debate here in Westminster, but it is an election year, and everything that the government and the opposition parties do is always closely defined by what that election strategy might be and what people beyond Westminster think of what will be announced today in that all-important budget. Let's go to the North East, to Newcastle, speak to our political correspondent there, Luke Walton. He is testing the temperature of people, business people and community leaders in Newcastle. Over to you, Luke.
Joe, I'm on the balcony of the Pitcher and Piano Bar on the iconic Tyne quayside, those famous bridges behind me. A bit cold and damp here in Newcastle this morning. So can the budget be a ray of sunshine? Well, I'm with three people with very different perspectives on that. First of all, Andy Radcliffe, you are the Chief Executive of S Group, which is a builder and a housing developer based in County Durham. What do you want to see from the Chancellor?
Well, as you'd expect, I'd like to see some support for housing to help us deliver the volume of housing that we desperately need in the country. The private housing market is in a kind of state of disarray at the moment as it adjusts to the new reality of interest rates at levels that we haven't really seen for coming on 20 years. There is talk of a 99% mortgage guarantee scheme, which may have some merit, but unless lenders come forward with products that are more attractive for buyers, I can't see it having a significant impact on demand. And actually, the Help to Buy scheme that was in previously was a much more impactful scheme that the government introduced.
Of course, levelling up was the big promise from the Conservatives to this part of the world. Are you seeing that, and do you want more of it?
Well, certainly. I mean, we've actually seen some good success in the levelled up bids in the North East particularly. And actually, the scheme that we're carrying out over here, the major refurbishment of the Tyne Bridge that we've just started on, is an example of some major investment in the North East. But of course, we need more. We have some world-class businesses in the North East, but we need to invest in infrastructure, in connectivity to allow them to attract the investment and the talent that they need to thrive. And
talking about investment, clearly there is this speculation that actually, in terms of long-term public spending, that may be squeezed in this budget. Would that worry you in terms of as a company that gets involved with infrastructure building?
Yeah, absolutely. If we want to level up the country, we need to invest in these major projects that attract investment and attract people, build housing that people can live and work in the right places. So yes, it's actually quite a concern if we have to see a depressed level of investment, certainly in the North East.
Well, Amanda Bailey, you are the director of the North East Child Poverty Commission, which researches and lobbies on that issue. What would you like to see from Jeremy Hunt?
I think we need to hear what the plan is for children and young people, and particularly children and young people on the very lowest incomes in places like the North East. You know, we all know that the North East can be the most fantastic place to live, to grow up, to raise a family, but it isn't for everybody. And until we make it a place where every child and young person can reach their potential, we're not going to do that as a region as a whole. And the reality is that our region has seen the steepest increases in child poverty of anywhere in the country over most of the last decade. And actually 1 in 5 children in the North East are living in what's known as deep or very deep poverty. And that level of inequality and hardship is just not acceptable in what remains one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
These are very deep-seated long-term problems, though. What could the Chancellor do today that actually make a difference?
In the immediate term, we need to see an urgent extension of something called a Household Support Fund. That's helped families in immediate crisis over most of the last 2 years.
And that's due to end, actually.
It's currently due to end at the end of this month. But in the longer term, we need what's the bigger picture and what's the bigger vision for children and young people. We need a government that's prepared to commit to ending child poverty, to a cross-government, cross-departmental, ambitious plan to say that, you know, this is wrong, that we have this level of inequality in our country, and particularly in places like the North East, and we're going to invest in children and families to improve that.
And when you hear that public sector spending may be squeezed in some departments in coming years, what does that raise for you?
I think that's really concerning. We know that all the services and support that families and children rely on are already overstretched in our region, whether that's schools, colleges, youth services, local authorities. I think what's particularly concerning is that that's going to be stretched by paying the price of a national insurance cut that will disproportionately not benefit the North East. So we may pay the price of a cut that actually benefits people in London and the South East the most.
Well, Johnson Fernandez, you're the founder of Equiwatt, a Gateshead-based tech firm. You're very much a growing company, a new company. What can the Chancellor do to actually encourage more businesses like that to this part of the world?
Yeah. So it's a challenging time, right, for everyone, isn't it? So what I would like to see is commitment to continue spend on innovation, because spending on innovation creates more businesses like us, creates more jobs, and then, that's how the economy can move forward.
You were telling me that actually being based in Gateshead is actually harder to attract investment, perhaps, than it would be if you were based in London.
Yes, that's right. And that's all part of the leveling up, isn't it? So, we need more connectivity, more presence of investors, more regional funds, so that we can, retain talent as well as acquire new talent and then grow our business. So, yeah.
I suppose the big headline we know about is this national insurance cut, yet another national insurance cut. Is that good news for your company and your staff?
Again, challenging times, right? So households are trying to, reduce the spend on clothing, energy bills, and we've seen that evidence in our business, where, by reducing energy demand at peak times, households can get pennies which add up. And this is the same measure that the government is trying to do by focusing on the sum of marginal gains on things like the national insurance. I think that's a great way forward.
Well, Johnson Fernandez, thank you, and thank you to all my guests. A long wish list there for the Chancellor. We'll find out very soon how much of it he can deliver. Joe.
Thank you very much, Luke. And of course, we'll return to you and your guests after the budget and get their reaction. Just listening there, getting a flavour, Faisal, of what certainly business people would like to see. Where are we in terms of levels of investment? What can they really hope for?
Well, Britain still has a productivity problem, which is the kind of foundation for rising living standards and growth and rising GDP per capita, the size of the economy per person. And that is why the Chancellor devoted half of his tax-cutting kind of energy and power and funding towards business expensing in the last autumn statement. We're not going to get anything like that again. There isn't the space. This is focused on personal tax cuts today. Although within that, the focus is on workers. So they hope that helps to not solve, but ameliorate one of the key problems in the economy, which is the shortage of workers. Put this together, by my calculations, you're talking kind of like maybe 50, 60,000 extra workers, hundreds of thousands of extra hours worked as a result of something focused on working. But there are some other reforms around the edges. There's this talk of a British ISA, which would focus the tax subsidies to saving at investments in the UK. That's very interesting. Returns to UK investments have been pretty poor in the stock market, and a lot of people with savings have chosen to go and invest in the American stock market and other stock markets which have been growing faster. So that will be, in a niche but important audience, a big thing if he goes through with that. He's been hinting at that for some time.
Well, let's return to the issue of tax, and let's show our viewers this graph. Tax as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of the economy. You can see there again, historically, if you go back to 1990, 1991, at the end of Margaret Thatcher's premiership, into John Major at 30.4%, climbing to 32.4% after, or during, I should say, the financial crash, into the coalition government. But then you see the figure there, 28, 29 in those years, rising to what would be a historic high of 37.7%. That's what's forecast there by the Office for Budget Responsibility. Now, people might ask, Chris, but we've got all these tax cuts being announced in national insurance. But it's not going to make a difference, is it, to the overall tax burden because of two very important things, including these tax thresholds that have been frozen?
Exactly. So it's back to that thing that the big picture is very hard for the Chancellor to shift. So he will announce tax cuts, and there's headlines about tax cuts, but that chart tells the bigger picture story that the tax burden for lots of people is higher than it's been in their lifetimes or for generations, and that takes some shifting. Now, it comes back to those big picture observations about the absence of growth, about the recent once in a generation, once in 100-year type events like the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. It means, though, what you'll get the argument from Labour being is one of, as you were mentioning it a few minutes ago, do you feel better off? Are you not paying more tax than you were X number of years ago? Now, that will vary depending on your own personal circumstances, but they believe that that's an argument that has resilience, such as the significance of the backdrop, which means it's so hard for a Chancellor to shift. But worth emphasising, on a day where we talk about the choices that the government faces, the choices that an opposition party faces. So
yes,
we've seen a critique.
they may inherit all this.
Well, yeah, and they've made a critique. Keir Starmer has made a critique that he says the government is salting the earth, in his view, with some of the things that the Conservatives are choosing to do. But what we'll hear from Labour later is that they agree with the idea of cutting taxes for workers.
Because they think the overall tax burden is too high as well.
Indeed. So they will choose to back that, but in so doing create a question for them about their own spending plans and what they therefore do if they win the election. So yes, there'll be some rhetoric from them, no doubt, about this idea of salting the earth, but at the same time they are choosing to accept elements of what the government is going to announce, when they could, if they wanted to, say, no, we wouldn't cut taxes here because we think the money should be spent elsewhere. But they don't want to do that.
No, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But before we do, I just want to show our viewers one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason, that the Chancellor is so limited in terms of his manoeuvrability and what he can do. Let's have a look at this graph on debt. Also, as a percentage of the nation's economy of GDP. You can see in 22-23, so up to last year, 84.9%, and it increases with each year, reaching a peak of 93.2%. And then you'll notice in 2028-29, it comes down marginally. Explain to us, Faisal, exactly what is meant when Jeremy Hunt talks about his fiscal rules, the rules that guide him in terms of what he can do when it comes to things like tax cuts, or perhaps putting any money that might be available in that forecast into public services, which it looks as if he's not going to do. Explain to us why it's significant.
These rules are meant as a kind of commitment device to everybody kind of in the markets, to people actually within the government themselves, to say we're going to keep the public finances in order in general terms. And they come in different guises, and we've had them under Labour governments and we've had them under Conservative governments, and they will continue whoever wins the election. And they're designed to sort of, if you like, send to the markets the general sense that you're kind of in control, that you won't let this go out of control. When you have a debt to GDP ratio close to 100% and you have low growth, those are the conditions where people can get a little concerned about where borrowing is going. So you set these rules. This debt rule is the one that is biting right now. There are other ones, but this is the one that matters. And as you explained, and is somewhat curious, it's kind of measured by the difference between what happens in the fourth year and the fifth year. And that equates, so it's a fall of 0.4% of GDP,
yes,
which equates to the £13 billion we'll be hearing a lot about. Now, there are all sorts of questions about whether that makes much sense. The 13 billion is in fact the difference between two massive numbers.
Yes, and the Institute of Fiscal Studies said it's an odd rule, is what they've called it.
Well, and you get an incentive to kind of play the rule rather than work out what it is that you want to do. But in general terms, what it does is it gives you a path of debt that is not going up. It's kind of stabilising, and then it kind of falls at the end. But to make very fine-tuned judgments on 5 or 6 billion here or 7 billion here, well, that is, you know, was that really the intent of people behind those rules, is the first thing. The reason why it's binding, though, is that the Chancellor has chosen to use up the space that he had. He had better forecasts than he thought, and he spent it on those tax cuts last time.
Choices.
Where this is going to end up, we think today, is that room is going to be extremely tight, as tight potentially as it has been, way below the average, and that creates some risks if the forecast goes in the wrong direction.
Chris?
Just one quick observation picking up on that chart that we've just seen, which plays into how people feel about the economy right now, which is that when you have a lot of debt, you're paying a lot in debt interest.
Absolutely.
Which gets to part of the argument as to why you might feel that you're paying rather a lot of tax but not seeing a huge amount of it back in terms of how you might judge public services, because quite a lot of money is going on servicing the interest on the national debt.
All right, let's just go into the chamber in the House of Commons. It's filling up, of course, as you would expect, ahead of Prime Minister's questions, which will be coming up in 15 minutes' time. And I should think the Speaker will be disciplined, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, in terms of timing as usual, so that Jeremy Hunt can get to his feet and deliver the budget at 12:30. We expect him to speak for about an hour, and then it will be the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, who will respond to what they've heard. Now, we are joined by two MPs in Central Lobby, just outside the chamber there, to get their views. Therese Coffey, Conservative MP, former Deputy Prime Minister, and Labour MP Rebecca Long-Bailey, who served in the former Labour leader's shadow cabinet. Welcome to both of you. Therese Coffey, we've just been talking about how limited the room is for the Chancellor and the fact that this budget is being announced against a backdrop of recession. As part of the Liz Truss government, are you in part to blame for what is now a very, very difficult straitjacket for Jeremy Hunt?
So let's just think about the challenges that the government is facing. And while the Prime Minister was Chancellor, I remember in Cabinet he was talking about the risks of inflation, how that would challenge us on debt repayments. But also we should recognise that inflation has principally been driven by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the impact that has had, not in energy costs, but in other ways of supply chains around the world. And indeed, I'm very conscious that cost of living challenge has been one of the main drivers in actually whether it was about when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, the significant amount of money paid to help people with their energy costs, both in their homes but also in businesses, but also the significant decisions that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak made together, which were the right ones with the furlough scheme and the support to keep British business going.
Right.
So there's a combination of factors
but you
that has now taken longer perhaps than some of these issues went on longer than was perhaps originally thought of when, say, things like the furlough scheme. It's also challenging to bring down inflation. And meanwhile, we've been increasing things like our defence spending, supporting our friends in Ukraine, when, if I remind you, a decade ago, the world did not help Ukraine at that time.
Right,
so there's a combination of factors,
right.
and that's why today has to be, how can we get stuff done within government better, I think, to get on with the building the hospitals, but also to get that growth the economy needs.
But you accept,
Labour needs growth as well as the Conservatives do.
Therese Coffey, you accept, I think, just about that tax-cutting budget of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, of which you were part, shocked the markets, sparking a run on the pound, sending borrowing costs spiralling and forcing the Bank of England to intervene in the bond market, has made things even more difficult. Do you accept that?
That's not what I said very straightforwardly, Joe. What I'm saying is that the Prime Minister, inflation did go up. That was primarily driven by illegal invasion of Ukraine.
All right.
And I'm conscious that some of these things that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years, COVID went on a lot longer than was expected. So it's that combination of factors, and we should bear in mind that the UK economy has been growing than most of the G7, faster than most of the G7. But we're still in that technical recession, and that's what we need to stimulate.
We're in recession. I mean, just briefly,
well,
before
as
I
the
get
Bank
to
of
you,
England's governor said to the Treasury Select Committee, it's a technical recession, and not particularly, they're not even sure they are in recession.
Well,
these things
we've
might
been
change.
in recession for ages. If you're calling it technical, we've been bumping along the bottom. I mean, Rebecca,
no, that's not true either, Joe.
Well, hang on. You were in Rebecca Long-Bailey. You were in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, and of course, he led the Labour Party to the worst election defeat in recent times. Do you think that's the reason that Labour, under Keir Starmer, is so very cautious in terms of what they are offering the electorate if they win the next election?
I think it's right to be cautious, but it's also right to offer a bold vision of national renewal, and that's what we're going to need after 14 years of this government. Today, I think we're going to see another budget that promises high wages, high growth, and they've been promising that for the last 14 years. yet we've got an economy that is stagnating, we've got public services that are on the verge of collapse due to cuts and chronic underfunding, and we've got everyday ordinary working people struggling to get by in a cost of living crisis. What this budget should be about today is about national renewal. It won't be. It's about election gimmicks for the Conservative Party, sadly, and paying for tax cuts out of public service sector cuts.
Right. So, Rebecca Long-Bailey, would you and should the Labour Party oppose those tax cuts and not vote in favour of them?
Well, it depends what tax cuts he's going to outline, frankly.
A 2p cut on national insurance.
Well, there's certainly the things that have been trailed over the last 24 hours, and my concern about that is not that I'd oppose them, it's that they disproportionately affect the wealthiest earners. So, for example, somebody who's earning £25,000 a year can look to get a saving of £250, whereas an MP, for example, could be getting £700 a year, and that is not acceptable. It's not helping the poorest and most vulnerable in society, and it's not creating a high-wage economy. What the Chancellor should be looking at is increasing the living wage to, for example, £15 an hour, which is what the TUC is calling for. He should set out a national mission to end in-work poverty. So whilst I wouldn't disagree with the national insurance cut per se, it has to come as part of a wider package to really boost people's incomes and living standards.
Is a 2p cut in national insurance enough to turn Conservative fortunes around, Therese Coffey?
Well, I think the focus is really about how can we help people continue to have this challenge of the cost of living. And if you think about how national insurance is applied, I think you will have to earn about £185 a week, and after that you start to pay national insurance. So this will help people part-time, this will help people who do a lot of seasonal work have more in their pay packet every month. And that is important. At the same time, we are starting to see energy costs come down. So there's been a variety of things that have come together and have really coalesced in this challenging time. But I think it's important that we continue to help people with that cost of living, but also to make sure that we have real focus on growth and unlocking the economy, and that includes some of the processes within government too.
Right. I mean, you've already cut 2p. It was announced in the autumn statement. It's come and people are feeling it in their pay packets, Therese Coffey, but it didn't change anything in the polls. You're still languishing 20 to 25 points behind Labour.
Well, clearly, I'm sure that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor would like to see our poll ratings go up. Of course they would. But this is also being driven by principles about trying to make sure that we help people, particularly at this challenging time, with the cost of living. It's why we've seen people have only seen the effect of that twice so far, and because it's monthly, it may not seem that much, but it is something giving back to them. Right. The other thing that happened in the autumn statement, we probably are not quite yet at that stage of the full year expensing. That will start to come as businesses realign some of their investment in capital, again to stimulate this long-term growth that we desperately need to get back on that positive track. And that's why I think together Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt will have put together a budget that's in the national interest. Of course, I want that to be the Conservative Party reflecting well from that, but more importantly is the national interest, the long-term plan, and frankly, at the moment, Labour isn't saying much at all on what they're going to do with the economy. That will be for them to answer.
Yeah, of course. But Rebecca, on that, I mean,
speculate.
Therese Coffey is right that you're not going to, as you yourself have said, oppose any of the measures in terms of tax cuts today. What's the difference between Labour and the Conservatives? There's nothing to pick between the two of you.
We'll set out our stall in detail before a general election, but there's a huge difference. We've got an economy that is being driven over the edge of a cliff by a government that has completely lost its way. It has no ideas whatsoever, whereas the Labour Party has set out a bold plan for national renewal. And that's not to say
that the Green Growth Plan's been dropped. That was part of your bold offering and it's gone.
And that's something that I feel very sad about, because I think one of the most important things that we should be doing to rebuild our economy is focusing heavily on industrial strategy, and it's about making wise investment decisions. Now, the pledge hasn't been dropped completely. There's still going to be that national investment package, but it does need to be bolder. If we're going to really tackle the productivity crisis that you've been speaking about earlier on your programme, that requires a national investment plan, it requires industrial strategy, and along with that will come with an increase in prosperity for everyone. But we need a government that's bold enough to do that. This government isn't. The Labour Party hopefully will be.
Rebecca Long-Bailey and Therese Coffey, thank you very much. There at Central Lobby. I'll let you take your places for Prime Minister's questions coming up in just over 5 minutes' time. And then, as I said, half an hour later, we expect Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, to get to his feet and unveil his budget. What What did you make of what you heard there from Therese Coffey and Rebecca Long-Bailey, Chris?
It's just fascinating, isn't it? It's a reminder that so many political parties, not least the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, are broad tents. So you have two contributors there whose principal recent loyalties were to recent failed leaders of the two respective parties in reality, and so you hear a splash of loyalty in the direction of their current front benches.
Well, it is an election year, of course.
Well, indeed, coupled with a desire to maintain what they might see as a sort of respectable distance, because they have their own authentic disagreements with their own front bench and a loyalty to the front bench that they served just a couple of years ago.
Right. Well, what's interesting, of course, as we always know, there are choices in politics, however tight the spending envelope. And Rebecca Long-Bailey saying she wouldn't oppose cuts to national insurance, to working people, but maybe she would like to see a future Labour government, commit to higher public spending. Let's just have a look at this graph here. Changes in day-to-day spending on public services, because these tax cuts will have to be paid for by either tax rises or cuts in public spending or borrowing, but Jeremy Hunt has sort of parked that. Now, these figures, just to explain, are the figures as they are now. They will change, no doubt, once Jeremy Hunt has unveiled his budget. Now, what you can see in 27-28, pencilled in, as we say, in the trade, Jeremy Hunt, 1% increase in day-to-day spending across departments above inflation. But, as we know, there are what we call protected departments. Protected, the NHS, schools, defence, overseas aid, which will get more than that, because they are protected areas, leaving unprotected areas like the Home Office, like Justice, with that level of cuts. And they could be quite serious, couldn't they?
They could, and these are all assumptions based on the level of protection continuing, which we don't know. To be clear, and sort of infamously in our circles, the OBR, the head of the OBR, told MPs that the plans for spending after the election were essentially worse than fiction, in the sense that fiction is actually written down. That was I know that ruffled some feathers in the government, but he was trying to make the point that if you're going to have permanent tax cuts, you should back them up with credible spending plans. Now, I think the Chancellor's going to really lean into this argument. He doesn't want to run away from it. He's going to say, yes, we think the state has got bigger because of the reasons we explained. The tax burden's got bigger. We now think from this starting point, it's got to come down, and that's the difference. Now, isn't this interesting? Because if we can take our minds back 4 or 5 years, the plan was to increase national insurance to over 13% to pay for, remember social care, the social care plan? To pay for that. Where's that gone? You know, and that is a symbol of a different time under Boris Johnson, where there were some arguments.
Well, he expanded obviously he expanded the state's...
But he wanted to do something to face a crisis in social care, which was impacting upon the NHS, and the method through which they were going to do that quite openly was to raise national insurance. Now, what's going to happen to that?
Quite. And it's back to your point, Joe, about things being penciled in. There's a lot of pencils used in and around Whitehall with all of these things, because so often, as Faisal was reflecting, looking back on the last couple of years, how much has changed, every likelihood that will happen into the future, and then from the Chancellor's point of view, teasing out some political dividing lines, but also doing that basic thing of human psychology, which is sort out today's problem before you worry about tomorrow.
Well, and you used the expression, I think, salted earth.
Quoting Keir Starmer from earlier in the year.
Yeah, and I mean, that is the potential headache. Well, it is going to be a headache if they do win the election, because they will be making these choices again a little bit further down the line, which is why they don't want to commit to anything in terms of spending. But those spending choices will be there, won't they?
They will, absolutely. But and shaped by the choices they also make today for exactly that same sort of basis in human psychology about the politics of now versus the headaches of tomorrow.
But they do have a choice over the fiscal rule. I mean, it is the choice of Rachel Reeves to say we're going to stick to the rule and we're going to stick to the baseline. And so therefore we inherit pretty much the same spending plans. And so are we in a sort of 1997 style situation
where they did inherit
where famously Ken Costa wasn't even going to stick to those spending plans.
And that comes back to a point of human psychology for Labour, in which they are conscious of being perceived to be vulnerable on the economy, so they hug a Conservative government pretty close. But that is a political choice.
Let's just have a look at what we expect in the budget. Just before Prime Minister's questions, I'll just keep an eye. A 2p reduction in national insurance contributions, which we've spoken about at length. A reduction in future spending increase. We've just been talking about that in order to pay for another tax cut on national insurance. Windfall tax on oil and gas extended to raise more money. Restricting non-dom tax status. Restricting rather than abolishing. We'll come on to that. It's a Labour policy, but it may be stolen by the Conservatives. And a tax on vapes and an increase in tobacco duty. Tax-raising measures there also to raise money to pay for those tax cuts. Relax rules on capital reserves for banks. And this is also, extending the freeze on fuel duty. Well, it's been extended year after year. What was temporary looks permanent. Tax breaks for holiday lets scrapped. Yes, those tax perks may well go. There's been some opposition to that, and £362 million investment for manufacturing. Finally, we can see Jeremy Hunt has now taken his seat, £800 million to reduce public sector waste. If we show you inside the chamber, you can see there Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has taken his seat. He is ready to stand up and deliver this budget. There is, of course, maybe a little bit hackneyed, Chris, to talk about a surprise.
Oh, the rabbit?
The rabbit. We're not allowed to say rabbit, but yeah, apparently.
Days like this where I get asked, what's the rabbit out of the hat going to be?
It's escaped.
Well, arguably at least one fluffy creature with big ears has been wandering around SW1 for the best part of the last 24 hours. Yeah. The question is there any others? I remember watching a speech at a party conference a little while ago, and I was told, oh, there's a rabbit. There's a rabbit in this particular speech. Afterwards, I said, did I just
blink and miss it?
It was. I think a smaller creature than a rabbit would be a reasonable description of what this surprise thing was. But who knows what?
There's one suggestion here from Kate Ferguson at The Sun, who has tweeted, sounds like Jeremy Hunt's budget bunny out of the hat will be reformed to the child benefit charge. At the moment, parents have to start paying child benefit back once they earn £50,000. So a pitch to middle-earning mums and dads. Yep. You're nodding away there.
There's been some big campaigning on this. It not just is a charge, it's also a massive red tape challenge that, frankly, some were arguing HMRC was not being able to cope with. People were phoning up, finding themselves, this is part of the fiscal drag story. People who didn't expect themselves to be were being dragged into this and finding that they had to hand back their child benefit, and you have to register on HMRC.
Well, let's go in for PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, including listening to the Chancellor's budget statement, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Charlotte Nettles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK used to be a world leader in psilocybin research, but despite the calls from the Home Affairs Select Committee, leading researchers, charities and veterans organisations and the Royal College of Psychiatrists, we've shamefully fallen behind on breakthrough treatment for conditions like PTSD and depression, causing misery to millions of people in our country. Can the Prime Minister explain why this policy remains the responsibility of a Home Office that can't give it the attention it deserves, and why it's OK that American, Canadian and Australian patients can access treatment British patients can't?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I completely sympathise and understand why people suffering from distressing conditions will want to seek the best possible treatment available, and I thank the Honourable Lady for raising the issue. We are committed to ensuring that the UK is a world-leading jurisdiction for pharmaceutical, clinical and other medical research, and we have, in fact, asked the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs to review barriers to legitimate medical research involving controlled drugs such as psilocybin. Our response to the Council's recommendations, I'm pleased to tell the Honourable Lady, will be published as soon as possible.
Dr. Kiranda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency has a long and proud history of farming, with generations of the same family helping to feed our nation. And not since World War II have we been so aware of how important food security is to our national security. So will the Prime Minister update the House on what his government is doing to support our fantastic farmers?
Mr. Speaker, as I set out at the NFU conference just a couple of weeks ago, we will always back British farmers to continue to produce fantastic food. We're accelerating that plan with the largest package of grants ever, and indeed one of those new schemes opens just today, supporting farmers with up to £125,000 towards the purchase of new equipment and technology. Our schemes in England are all about more choice, Mr. Speaker, not less, and unlike Labour in Wales, we will never introduce top-down arbitrary targets that damage farm incomes, damage our food security and take farmers back to square one.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 years ago, Sarah Everard was walking home when she was abducted and murdered by a serving police officer who should have been trusted to keep her safe. As a father, I can't imagine the pain her parents, her family and her friends are going through in this difficult anniversary week. Lady Angelina's report exposes the appalling failure in police vetting and in misconduct processes. And I'm very troubled by its conclusion that there is, and I'm going to quote it, nothing to stop another Cousins operating in plain sight. How can that be the case 3 years on from this horrendous crime?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I firstly say that I'm sure all members of the House will have been thinking about Sarah Everard in recent weeks. It was, as the Honourable Gentleman said, an absolutely shocking case, and the abuse of power in particular was appalling. That's why we took action quickly, Mr. Speaker, to strengthen police vetting, strengthen the rules for rooting out officers who are not fit to serve, and conducted the largest ever screening of all serving officers and staff. We're now ensuring that any officer who has been charged for a crime will be suspended from duty automatically until their case is concluded, and we will thoroughly consider all of the report's recommendations and respond in full.
The Prime Minister mentions vetting, and I just want to press on that because serious failures in police vetting were raised in independent reports as long ago as 2012, 2019, 2022 and 2023. And that's why Labour's been arguing for mandatory national vetting standards, which would stop anybody with a history of domestic abuse or sexual offending being allowed to join the police in the first place. Why are mandatory national vetting standards not already in place?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is vital for public confidence that those that are not fit to wear the badge are rooted out of the police and not able to join in the first place. That's why the College of Policing has updated its existing statutory code on vetting, and that happened quickly. And in addition, the Policing Inspectorate, Mr. Speaker, carried out a rapid inspection of all forces' progress against the previous findings. And in addition to that, an entire check against the National Police Database was carried out for all serving officers and staff.
Mr. Speaker, I'm obviously very familiar with codes in criminal justice systems, but this is too serious for that. There's a world of difference between a code and binding mandatory standards, which don't have legal effect, and that should trouble members across the House. Cousins' history of sexual offending stretched back many years. On 4 occasions, despite allegations of indecent exposure, he wasn't sacked. We know indecent exposure is a gateway to more horrific crimes, as was tragically shown to be the case not only in Sarah Everard's case, but also Libby Squire. But it's not treated with the seriousness required. The Angelina report recommends reviewing all indecent exposure allegations against serving officers in order to identify, investigate and remove those officers from service. Now, given the obvious urgency of this recommendation, can the Prime Minister give a categorical assurance that it will be implemented immediately?
Mr. Speaker, as the Home Secretary addressed this specifically when he made his statement, indecent exposure, just like any other kind of sexually motivated crime, is abhorrent. And we expect police chiefs to take it extremely seriously. We fully expect police chiefs to suspend an officer charged with any kind of sexually motivated crime, and it's worth pointing out, in addition to the new powers that the Home Secretary outlined about automatic suspension, Chief Constables already do have existing powers to suspend any officer in their force when allegations are made, and we fully expect them to use those powers.
It's all fine, is it? It's all okay?
Well, I do think the recommendation I referred to should be implemented urgently, and I ask the Prime Minister to look again at that, because every day that goes past when it isn't implemented carries risk for victims in these cases. Sarah Everard's murder should, of course, been a watershed moment on policing reform, on the criminal justice system, on violence against women and girls. But the sad reality is that victims of rape who have the courage and bravery to come forward have just a 2.4% chance of their perpetrators being caught and charged within the year. How does the Prime Minister expect women to have confidence in the criminal justice system when almost all rapists don't see the inside of a courtroom?
Mr. Speaker, as we acknowledged a couple of years ago, of course we need to do more to improve rape outcomes in the criminal justice system. And the Rape Action Review Plan, is showing considerable progress, Mr. Speaker. We've already increased the average sentences for rape by a third since Labour were last in office, Mr. Speaker. By the way, using a power that the Labour Party voted against in this House. And thanks to our action plan, we've seen police referrals double, charges double, and last year there was a 50% increase in rape convictions, and now rapists will serve every single day of their sentence behind bars. And the honourable gentleman did raise his time at the Crown Prosecution Service, but he hasn't acknowledged that under his tenure, rape convictions actually dropped.
Well, the Prime Minister knows that is going to be fact-checked. He also knows I support tough sentences. I really do think that the victims of violence against women and girls deserve better than this nonsense from the Prime Minister. It needs to be taken seriously. It's not games, Prime Minister. We all want more victims to come forward, but we have to be honest. Unless things change, the criminal justice system will continue to fail them. That's why we're committed to introducing specialist rape and sexual offences teams in every force to give victims specialist support and confidence that their experience will be investigated properly. When will the Prime Minister commit to doing the same?
Mr. Speaker, we've already implemented a Rape Action Review Plan. He says about taking this seriously. Here are the things that we have done, Mr. Speaker. We have ended the appalling digital strip search that victims had to go through with their mobile phones. We've ensured that there's better use of pre-recorded cross-examination. We've rolled out Operation Sorteria with incredible success across all national police forces, and we have increased significantly the number of independent sexual, domestic violence and abuse advisors to up to 1,000, and there is more specialist training in all police forces for these prosecutions. That is a plan that we've already put in place. It's a plan that is working to ensure that we can keep women and girls in our country safe.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is the rosy picture the Prime Minister tries to paint of the current criminal justice system is completely at odds with the confidence many women currently have in it. And with the publication of the Angelina report, the country deserves to know that we're doing all we can to make our country safe for women. That starts with what should be the most basic task, creating a safe workplace here in Westminster. And at the moment, as everyone in this House knows, we are failing in that endeavour, and we all have a duty to change this. So when will he make time for the vote on banning from Parliament MPs who face allegations of sex offences?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it is absolutely right that we ensure our communities are safe for women and girls. That's why we passed the landmark Domestic Abuse Act. That's why we set up a new 24/7 victim support line. It's why we've quadrupled funding for victim support, and why we are investing in practical things like CCTV and better street lighting in safer communities up and down the country. Now, of course, there is always more we can do, but this government has a strong track record in ensuring that women across this country will feel safe.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I want the Prime Minister to know
that the people of Romford are struggling with ever-increasing energy prices, yet providers are making huge profits, running into hundreds of millions. So, does the Prime Minister agree with me that reductions in wholesale prices should be passed on to the consumers and standing charges brought down? And will the government hold utility companies to account for their actions?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to highlight the challenge that high energy bills have posed, not just to his constituents in Romford, but across the country. That's why we stepped in with a significant package of support, paying for around half of a typical household energy bill when prices were at their highest. My honourable friend, I know, will join me in welcoming the fact that the energy price cap is set to fall by almost £250 in April, which will bring relief to many families, but we must hold companies to account, and that's why we introduced the energy profits levy on the windfall profits caused by an unexpected increase in energy prices, and we are going further to cut costs for people by cutting their taxes and putting more money in their family bank accounts.
SNP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, much to my surprise this morning, it's been widely reported that the Conservative Party in Scotland are absolutely furious that Westminster is about to tax Scotland's natural resources in order to pay for a tax cut in England. Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister in danger of turning his colleagues into nationalists?
Mr. Speaker, obviously I wouldn't comment on the budget, but what I would say is, when I was in Scotland last week, it was crystal clear. There has only ever been one party consistently standing up for the North Sea energy industry, and it's the Scottish Conservatives.
The Prime Minister knows that not to be the case, but there's a serious point to be made here, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative Party want to use Scotland's natural resources to pay for tax cuts in England. The Labour Party want to use Scotland's natural resources to pay for nuclear power stations in England, and the cost of that up to 100,000 jobs. Scotland's wealth, Scotland's resources, Scotland's jobs, all a game to Westminster. But with the Tories on just 15% in the polls in Scotland now, will the Prime Minister do us all a favour and call a general election?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman claims to be supportive of the North Sea energy industry. Why is it that he's opposed all the measures that we have taken to protect those jobs in Scotland over the past couple of years? He talks about tax in Scotland and England. I'll just gently point out to him that thanks to the actions of the Chancellor and this UK government, everyone in Scotland has received a significant tax cut from January this year. And in contrast to the Chancellor's last budget, the SNP's budget put taxes up for working Scots. Scotland is now the high tax capital of the UK, but this Conservative government is going to keep cutting taxes for hard-working Scots.
Speaker, the government is rightly acting to properly compensate the Horizon victims who are highlighted by Alan Bates's legal challenge. However, there are thousands more sub-postmasters across the country who are not actually prosecuted, but who faced financial penalties for bogus shortfalls, causing enormous financial and personal distress to them. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that we should now be doing everything possible to do right by all victims of gross miscarriage of justice, clear their names, and at last properly financially compensate?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the appalling impact this miscarriage of justice has had on people's mental health. As he acknowledged, our focus is on delivering justice for the postmasters, and that's why we will introduce legislation to overturn convictions and pave the way for the swift payment of compensation, which he acknowledged. But I thank my honourable friend for his long-standing campaign on this issue about mental health, and I can assure him that the Postal Minister is closely examining the issues he raises. He's considering next steps and will keep the right honourable gentleman closely informed.
Sir Geoffrey Donalds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that the Government's proposals to deal with the legacy of our troubled past in Northern Ireland continue to be the subject of scrutiny, most recently in the High Court ruling in relation to compatibility with our human rights obligations. And yet, many families of victims in Northern Ireland are deeply disappointed with the lack of cooperation by the Irish government in relation to murders committed in their jurisdiction or from their jurisdiction. In relation to the Omagh bomb inquiry, for example, the Irish government has declined to conduct a public inquiry on this worst atrocity in our troubled past, despite the courts urging it to do so. Will the Prime Minister continue to press the Irish government on the need for them to make available facilities to enable the families of innocent victims, including in Omagh, to pursue justice for their loved ones?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question on this important topic, which I know will be of great interest not just to his constituents but many others across Northern Ireland. The government has set forward its plans to deal with the legacy of the past and will continue to engage with everyone in Northern Ireland, whatever their views, to set out the best way forward. But I can confirm to him that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has raised these specific issues directly with the Irish government and will continue to do so. And I also spoke to the Taoiseach myself about this very matter. We would hope to see further cooperation on Omagh and many other outstanding cases that involve Irish jurisdiction, because like him, I want to give families as much information as possible.
Hello, Plesty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Putin's put the Russian economy on a total war footing. He has increased military spending by 68% to 7.5% of GDP. He claimed this month that over 520,000 new jobs have been created in their arms industry, which now employs an estimated 3.5 million Russians. On my recent visits to Ukraine, I've met with government ministers and senior military figures who have expressed great frustration to me about the length of time it is taking to develop collaboration in building a defence manufacturing capability jointly with UK defence companies in Ukraine. So will my honourable friend meet with me to discuss how we can unblock the bureaucracy and, as our Ukrainian friends say, build the arsenal of the free world together?
Well, I can reassure my honourable friend that we remain steadfast in our support for Ukraine, and we will not allow Putin to achieve his aim of eradicating Ukrainian freedom and democracy. Our cross-government task force is working diligently to support both the armed forces of Ukraine and lead UK and Ukrainian defence industrial cooperation. I'm pleased to say in December last year we conducted our first successful trade mission to Ukraine alongside the UK defence industry. But I can tell him that the government and UK industry will continue to work hand in glove with our Ukrainian allies, seizing the opportunities for collaboration and bolstering our joint defence industries.
Stringer.
Mr. Speaker, last week the IPPR published a paper, The State of the North. That paper predicted that wealth inequalities, already too large between the North and the South East, would increase to nearly £250,000 per head by the end of this decade. Does the Prime Minister accept that his levelling up agenda has failed, or did he never want it to succeed?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on the contrary, inequality in our country has actually declined under this Conservative government. And when it comes to levelling up in the North, it's actually the North that has received some of the highest amounts of per capita levelling up funding of any region in the country. And I know when he last popped up to ask me a question about our investment in the North, I was wondering if he's managed to get an answer as to what exactly the Labour Party's position on HS2 is. Because I'd still like to know, because what we're doing is taking that money and reinvesting every penny of it across the North in forms of transportation that people use every day, delivering benefits quicker to communities not just in his constituency but across the entire North, and it's been warmly welcomed everywhere that I've been.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that the performance of the Labour Party in voting down our Rwanda bill in the House of Lords is a disgrace? It is only the Conservative government and the Conservatives who have a plan for dealing with illegal immigration and the people's fund. Action on illegal immigration is a top priority in my constituency, and Labour has no policy or plan on this at all.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. He knows, like I know, that if you want to fully stop the boats, you need to have a working deterrent. That means if someone comes here illegally, you must be able to remove them to a safe third country alternative. That's why the Rwanda scheme is so important, and that's why we're determined to see it through. But it was just in the last week an independent report was published talking about the Labour Party's policies in this area, which made it crystal clear that they don't have a plan to stop the boats, and in fact their idea would see the UK accept hundreds of thousands more migrants.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Which part of his economic legacy is the Prime Minister most proud of? Is it presiding over the highest tax burden since the Second World War? Or is it delivering the slowest real wage growth since the Napoleonic War?
Mr. Speaker, saving 10 million jobs in the pandemic with the furlough scheme.
The Prime Minister will know that there is consensus across this House on the need to build new houses. Where that consensus breaks down is where those houses should be built. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that wherever possible, new houses should be built on brownfield sites, not on green spaces, not on greenfield, and certainly not on prime farmland?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. It's sustainable planning that must be at the heart of our planning system, and that's why we're committed to meeting the needs of communities by building homes in the right places and, as he says, making best use of brownfield land. We've made it clear that that's what should be the priority. We've put extra funding aside to unlock those sites, and our recent changes to the MPPF provide clearer protection for the Green Belt, making it clear how future housing supply should be assessed. And that is the clear difference between our two parties. On this side of the House, we will protect the Green Belt, and the Labour Party will concrete right all over it.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in some jurisdictions, ministers routinely publish their tax returns. The Prime Minister voluntarily published his UK tax returns last year. Does the Prime Minister agree that ministers of the Crown should publish their tax returns as a matter of course? And has he ever filed any returns in the USA that have not been published?
Mr. Speaker, I don't think that would be proportionate or appropriate, and what I've done is... No, I don't think it would be proportionate for all ministers to publish their tax returns. In keeping with a long-standing tradition, I voluntarily published my tax return, as did the Chancellor. I think that is the right balance, and I've been completely transparent about that as I've done it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, a number of us were on the first transatlantic flight powered by sustainable aviation fuel. This week, IAG made its first major purchase of that fuel. But that fuel is coming from the United States. And it's really important that we have a SAF industry in this country. So will the Prime Minister tell the Treasury and the Department of Transport to accelerate the work they're doing, to put in place the right framework and the right support mechanisms to ensure we have a SAF industry for our aviation sector for the future?
Can I first of all thank my honourable friend for his championing of this cause, which I think is absolutely right, and reassure him that we are committed to ensuring that the SAF mandate is in place in 2025. That will require about 10% of jet fuel to be made from sustainable feedstock by 2030. And to get there, we've provided, I'm pleased to tell him, £135 million to 13 different UK sustainable aviation fuel projects to kickstart our domestic industry. And, which he also knows is important, we've committed to introducing a revenue certainty mechanism to support SAF production in the UK as soon as practically possible.
Sam Dixon.
Thank you. Chester's 2,000-year-old Roman walls are an important historic monument of world renown. Will the PM join me in Chester to walk the walls and explore how the government can support the upkeep of these important structures, which, unlike the Conservative Party, are stable, solid, and in no danger of imminent collapse?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I join the honourable lady I join Lady in paying tribute to the history of her local community, and I'm pleased that the City of Chester is benefiting from so much investment from the Conservative government so that it can maintain its local infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 5 weeks ago, Conservative MPs from across South East London and Kent wrote to Transport for London and the Labour Mayor of London, calling on them to do the right thing following the botched implementation of a temporary 40-mile-an-hour speed limit on the A20 near Sidcup, which has seen thousands of drivers unfairly issued fines and points on their licence. Yes. This has left many drivers, including carers, emergency service workers and teachers, at risk of losing their licences and jobs. This is despite travelling less than 50-mile-an-hour zones. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that TfL, the Met Police and Sadiq Khan must come clean about the number of fines and cancel these issued points?
Can I thank my honourable friend for this question, and I do understand the concerns that local drivers have over this ongoing TfL issue. Whilst we're doing everything we can to back motorists across the country, it is disappointing that the Labour Mayor and indeed Labour-run Wales are hammering drivers at every opportunity, whether that's temporary speed limits or blanket 20-mile-an-hour zones or the ULEZ expansion. But I will make sure that my honourable friend has a meeting with a responsible minister to discuss his concerns.
Mr. Speaker, to strengthen current spiking legislation, forensic evidence is essential. The NHS does not have uniform policy for the screening of suspected victims of spiking at A&E. We can pass all the laws we want in this place, but to achieve justice, this forensic evidence is vital. Will the Prime Minister commit to ensuring that hospital emergency departments have a statutory obligation to take forensic samples from these victims?
I agree with the Honourable Lady that spiking is an appalling, violating crime which seriously undermines public safety, particularly the safety of women and girls, and we want to make sure that the existing laws recognise the threat that spiking poses, and that's why at the end of last year we announced a raft of new measures to confront spiking and support victims, including changing the law to make it clear without any doubt that spiking is illegal, as well as other measures like an online reporting tool, investing in research and rapid testing kits, and training for bar staff. But I'll ensure that we look into the issue that she raises and write back to her.
Final question, Ben Bradley.
This winter, flood and storm damage has caused significant damage to the infrastructure in and around my Mansfield constituency. That's our roads, it's our drains, it's flood infrastructure, and this is among the highest concern that residents raise with me on a regular basis. I'm really grateful that from next year in particular, there's very significant infrastructure funding coming our way. But what can my right honourable friend do to help fix this for my constituents now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that in 2020 we announced that we would double our flood investment to a record £5.2 billion, and in Nottinghamshire since 2010 we've invested over £50 million to protect 15,000 properties, and I know currently there is a programme in Mansfield which is looking at surface water and drainage improvements, but I will make sure that I talk to the Chancellor that we have a strong economy to keep investing in local infrastructure in his area, and that's exactly what we're about to hear from my right honourable friend in just a second.
Completes Prime Minister's questions.
Well, you heard there Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, saying that completed Prime Minister's questions. It's always a little bit different, the PMQ's just ahead of the budget. He has vacated the chair for the Deputy Speaker, Eleanor Lang. There she is, presiding over the budget, as is traditional and normal, as the Chairman of Ways and Means. She will be going through some of the notices ahead of Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, delivering his budget statement. He'll take to his feet shortly and will probably speak for about an hour, perhaps a little bit less, and then it will be, of course, the turn of the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, to respond. We will take both of those live and uninterrupted, and we will then have reaction from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Laura Trott, part of the Treasury team, and her shadow for Labour. Here's Jeremy Hunt.
Madam. Seriously, what's the point in doing that? Why just not keep the fucking show going? You stupid cunts. Oh, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna be special. We're gonna do Politics Live. And then stop it as soon as he starts talking.
Madam Deputy Speaker.
You bunch of fucking clowns at the BBC, honestly. You fucking useless cunts.
As we mourn the tragic loss of life in Israel and Gaza, the Prime Minister reminded us last week of the need to fight extremism and heal divisions. So I start today by remembering the Muslims who died in 2 world wars in the service of freedom and democracy. We need a memorial to honour them, so following representations from the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove and others, I've decided to allocate £1 million towards the cost of building one. Whatever your faith or colour or class, this country will never forget the sacrifices made for our future. Madam Deputy Speaker, in recent times the UK and the UK economy has dealt with a financial crisis, a pandemic and an energy shock caused by war in Europe. Yet despite the most challenging economic headwinds in modern history, under Conservative governments since 2010, growth has been higher than every large European economy. Unemployment has halved, absolute poverty has gone down, and there are 800 more people in jobs for every single day that we've been in office. Of course, interest rates remain high as we bring down inflation. But because of the progress we've made, because we are delivering the Prime Minister's economic priorities, we can now help families not just with temporary cost of living support, but with permanent cuts in taxation. We do this to give much needed help in challenging times, but also because Conservatives know lower taxes mean higher growth. And higher growth means more opportunity, more prosperity, and more funding for our precious public services. But if we want that growth...
What? The Chancellor has hardly said anything. Order! You can't get excited yet. Now, other people want to hear what the Chancellor has to say, and it's matters. So we'll have a bit of good behaviour, please. Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If we want that growth to lead to higher wages and higher living standards for every family in every corner of the country, it cannot come from unlimited migration. It can only come by building a high-wage, high-skill economy, not just higher GDP, but higher GDP per head. And that is the difference with the party opposite. Their plans destroy jobs, reduce opportunities, and risk family finances with spending that pushes up taxes. Instead of going back to square one, the policies I announced today mean more investment, more jobs, better public services and lower taxes in a budget for long-term growth. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I start with the updated forecast from the OBR, for which I thank Richard Hughes and his team. First, inflation. When the Prime Minister and I came to office, it was 11%. The latest figures show... I know the party opposite struck...
No, this is not amusing anymore. We need to hear what the Chancellor has to say. I can tell who's making the noise, and you simply won't get a chance to speak later. So that's the end of it. Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When the Prime Minister and I came to office, inflation was 11%, but the latest figures show it is now 4%, more than meeting our pledge to halve it last year. And today's forecasts from the OBR show it falling below the 2% target in just a few months' time, nearly a whole year earlier than forecast in the autumn statement. That didn't happen by accident.
Whatever the pressures and whatever the politics, a Conservative government working with the Bank of England will always put sound money first. But we also understand that tackling inflation, while necessary, is painful. It means higher interest rates and a period of lower growth. So we've given the average household £3,400 in cost of living support over the last 2 years. Doing so makes economic as well as moral sense. The OBR predicted real household disposable income per person would fall by 2% in the last year. Instead, after this support, it is on track to rise by 0.8%. And today I take further steps to help families with cost of living pressures, starting with measures to help the poorest families. We've already abolished higher charges for electricity paid by those on prepayment meters, increased the local housing allowance, and raised benefits by double expected inflation. Today I focus on those falling into debt. Nearly 1 million households on universal credit take out budgeting advance loans to pay for more expensive emergencies like boiler repairs or help getting a job. To help make such loans more affordable, I've today decided to increase the repayment period for new loans from 12 months to 24 months. For some people, I thought they cared about people on the lowest incomes. But trust the Labour Party not to want to hear about debt. For some people, the best way to resolve debt is through a debt relief order. But getting one costs £90, which can deter the very people who need them the most. So having listened carefully to representations from citizens' advice, I today relieve pressure on around 40,000 families every year by abolishing the £90 charge completely. Next, the Household Support Fund. It was set up on a temporary basis and due to conclude at the end of this month. Having listened carefully to representations from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Trussell Trust, and honourable members from East Ham, Colchester, Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, and Suffolk Coastal, amongst others, I've decided that with the battle against inflation still not over, now is not the time to stop the targeted help it offers. We will therefore continue it at current levels for another 6 months. Next, I turn to a measure that will help businesses and households more broadly. In the autumn statement, I froze alcohol duty until August of this year. Without any action today, it would have been due to rise by 3%. But I've listened carefully to my right honourable friends from Altrincham and Sale West, the Vale of Glamorgan, and my right honourable friend from Murray, who is a formidable champion of the Scottish whisky industry. I also listened to Councillor John Tonks from Ash, a strong supporter of the wonderful Admiral pub, who pointed out the pressures facing the industry. So today I've decided to extend the alcohol duty freeze until February 2025. This benefits 38,000 pubs across the UK, and on top of the £13,000 saving a typical pub will get from the 75% business rates discount I announced in the autumn. We value our hospitality industry and are backing the great British pub. Another cost that families and businesses worry about is fuel. Now, the Shadow Chancellor complained about the freeze on fuel duty, and Labour has opposed it at every opportunity. The Labour Mayor of London wants to punish motorists even more with his ULEZ plans, but lots of families and sole traders depend on their car. If I did nothing, fuel duty would increase by 13% this month. So instead, I've listened to my right honourable friends for Stoke-on-Trent North, Dudley North, Witham and others, as well as the Sun newspaper's Keep It Down campaign, I have, as a result, decided to maintain the 5p cut and freeze fuel duty for another 12 months. This will save the average car driver £50 next year and bring total savings since the 5p cut was introduced to around £250. Taken together with the alcohol duty freeze, this decision also reduces headline inflation by 0.2 percentage points in 24/5, allowing us to make faster progress towards the Bank of England's 2% target. Madam Deputy Speaker, there can be no solid growth without solid finances. An economy based on sound money does not pass its bills to the next generation. When it comes to borrowing, some believe there is a trade-off between compassion and fiscal responsibility. They are wrong. It is only because we responsibly reduce the deficit by 80% between 2010 and 2019 that we could provide £370 billion to help businesses and families in the pandemic. The party opposite opposed our plans to reduce the deficit every single step of the way. But in fairness, they were consistent. The Lib Dems supported controlling spending in coalition, but now say they would prop up a party that will turn on the spending taps. It's the difference between no plan and no principles. And I'm delighted the right honourable gentleman from the Lib Dems was here to hear it for once. Today, we say something different. There is nothing compassionate about running out of money. With the pandemic behind us, we must once again be responsible and build up our resilience to future shocks. That means bringing down borrowing so we can start to reduce our debt. And today's figures confirm that is happening. Ahead of my first autumn statement in 22, the OBR forecast headline debt would rise to above 100% of GDP. Today, they will say it will fall in every year to just 94% by 28-29. Underlying debt, which excludes Bank of England debt, will be 91.7% in 24/5, according to the OBR, then 92.8%, 93.2%, 93.2% before falling to 92.9% in 28-29, with final year headroom against debt falling of £8.9 billion. Our underlying debt is therefore on track to fall as a share of GDP, meeting our fiscal rule. And we continue to have the second lowest level of government debt in the G7, lower than Japan, France or the United States. We also meet our second fiscal rule for public sector borrowing to be below 3% of GDP 3 years early. Borrowing falls from 4.2% of GDP in 23/4 to 3.1%, 2.7%, 2.3%, 1.6% and 1.2% in 2028-29. By the end of the forecast, borrowing is at its lowest level of GDP since 2001. None of that, of course, would be possible if Labour implemented their pledge to decarbonise the grid 5 years early by 2030. By their own calculations, that costs £28 billion a year to do. But last month, after flip-flopping for months, they said they're not going to spend the £28 billion after all, but somehow they'll meet their pledge. Somehow, Madam Deputy Speaker, can only mean one thing: tax rises on working families. Same old Labour. Today, in contrast, a Conservative government brings down taxes with borrowing broadly unchanged. In fact, borrowing is slightly lower than the autumn statement. And the fact that we are bringing borrowing down is something of particular importance to one very special person. Sir Robert Stamen is the outgoing Chief Executive of the Government's Debt Management Office. And after 20 years of exceptional public service, he is in the gallery. Thank you, Sir Robert. I now turn to growth. Just after I became Chancellor, the OBR expected GDP to fall by 1.4% in the following year. In fact, it grew, albeit slowly. Now the OBR expects the economy to grow by 0.8% this year and 1.9% next year, 0.5% higher than their autumn forecast. After that, growth rises to 2.2%, 1.8% and 1.7% in 2028. Since 2010, they don't want to hear this, but these are the facts. Since 2010, we have grown faster than Germany, France or Italy, the three largest European economies. And according to the IMF, we will continue to grow faster than all three of them in the 5 years ahead. Surveys by Lloyds and Deloitte show business confidence is returning. In other words, because we have turned the corner on inflation, we will soon turn the corner on growth. And today's OBR forecasts also show that we have made good progress on the Prime Minister's three economic priorities. Compared to when the three pledges were made, inflation has halved, debt is falling in line with our fiscal rules, and growth is fully 1.5 percentage points higher than predicted. And as growth returns, they don't have a growth plan, so they might as well listen to ours. As growth returns, our plan is for economic growth not sustained through migration, but one that raises wages and living standards for families. Not just higher GDP, but higher GDP per head, and that means sticking to our plan with a budget for long-term growth, more investment, more jobs, better public services and lower taxes. And I start with investment. Economists say that stimulating investment is the most effective way to raise productivity and therefore wages and living standards. Since 2010, we've been doing just that. Business, well, you might want to listen to what I'm about to say because business investment has risen from an average of 9.3% of GDP under Labour to 9.9% under the Conservatives. And this year it will be 10.6% of GDP. That is £30 billion more business investment than if it had continued at Labour levels. And it's still going up. In the short period since the autumn statement, Nissan have announced they'll build 2 new electric car models in the UK. Microsoft and Google have announced data centres worth over £3 billion. Thanks to my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, the Global Investment Summit unlocked £30 billion of investment. In fact, since 2010, greenfield foreign direct investment has been higher than anywhere else in Europe. And for the last 3 years, we have been the third highest in the world after the United States and China. And we're not stopping there. In the autumn statement, I announced we would introduce permanent full expensing, a £10 billion tax cut for businesses that gives the UK the most attractive investment tax regime of any large European or G7 country. It was welcomed by over 200 business leaders, with the CBI saying it was a game changer and the single most transformational thing we could do to fire up the British economy. And today I take further steps to boost investment. Having listened to calls from the CBI, Make UK and the BCC, we'll shortly publish draft legislation for full expensing to apply to leased assets, a change I intend to bring in as soon as it's affordable. We'll also help small businesses, something close to my own heart, as well as the business rate support and work on prompt payments I announced in the autumn. I'll provide £200 million of funding to extend the recovery loan scheme as it transitions to the growth guarantee scheme, helping 11,000 SMEs access the finance they need. And following representations from the Federation of Small Business, as well as honourable members for Loughborough, Southend West and Rother Valley, I will reduce the administrative and financial impact of VAT by increasing the VAT registration threshold from £85,000 to £90,000 from April the 1st, the first increase in 7 years. That will bring tens of thousands of businesses out of paying VAT altogether and encourage many more to invest and grow. I now move to measures to address historic underinvestment in our nations and regions. Since we started levelling up in 2019, 2/3 of all new salaried jobs have been created outside London and the South East. We've announced 13 investment zones and 12 free ports, which continue to attract investment, including recently, thanks to the efforts of Mayor Ben Houchen from the Numa Group, who are investing £15 million into the Tees Valley investment zone. Today, working with the Levelling Up Secretary, I devolve further power to local leaders who are best placed to promote growth in their areas. I can announce the North East Trailblazer devolution deal, providing a package of support for the region potentially worth over £100 million. I'll devolve powers to Buckinghamshire, Warwickshire, and to the most beautiful county in England, Surrey. I see the Leader of the Opposition smiling because, like me, he is a Surrey boy. I know he's been taking advice from Lord Mandelson, who yesterday rather uncharitably said he needed to shed a few pounds. Ordinary families will shed more than a few pounds if that lot get in. Today, if he wants to join me on my marathon training, he's most welcome as well. Today, we continue to spread opportunity throughout the country by allocating £100 million of levelling up funding to areas including High Peak, Dundee, Conway, Erewash, Redditch and Coventry to support cultural projects in these communities, alongside support for capital projects across the country, including in Bingley. We are expanding the long-term plan for towns to 20 new places, including Darlington, home of the Treasury's fantastic Darlington Economic Campus, Coleraine, Peterhead, Runcorn, Harlow, Eastbourne, Arbroath and Rhyl, providing each with £20 million of funding to invest in community regeneration over the next decade. We'll provide £15 million in new funding to the West Midlands Combined Authority to support culture, heritage and investment projects on the recommendation of our go-getting Mayor Andy Street. And we'll allocate £5 million to renovate hundreds of local village halls across England so they can remain at the heart of their communities. And because this is a Conservative and Unionist government, we'll also set aside funding to support the Saxavord Spaceport in Shetland, an agri-food launchpad in mid-Wales, and funding to support Northern Ireland's businesses to expand global trade and investment opportunities. As a result of the decisions we take today, the Scottish Government will receive nearly £300 million in Barnet consequentials, with nearly £170 million for the Welsh Government and £100 million for the Northern Ireland Executive. I do appreciate that a tax-cutting budget is very uncomfortable for the biggest tax risers in the United Kingdom. We also want to level up opportunity across the generations, including building more houses for young people, and we're on track to deliver over 1 million homes in this Parliament. Last week, the Levelling Up Secretary allocated £188 million to support projects in Sheffield, Blackpool and Liverpool, and today I go further, allocating £242 million of investments in Barking Riverside and Canary Wharf, which together will build nearly 8,000 houses, as well as transforming Canary Wharf into a new hub for life science companies. We're launching a new £20 million community-led housing scheme supporting local communities to deliver the developments they want and need, and I'm pleased to announce the next steps for Cambridge to reach its potential to be the world's leading scientific powerhouse. I confirm there will be a long-term funding settlement for the Future Development Corporation in Cambridge at the next spending review, with over £10 million invested in the coming year to unlock delivery of crucial local transport and health infrastructure. The final levelling up measures I announced today support North Wales, where I have many happy childhood memories, in mould, following representations from the Honourable Member for the Vale of Clwyd. We will help fund the renovation of Theatre Clwyd. And I can announce this week the Government has reached agreement on a £160 million deal with Hitachi to purchase the Wilfer site in Innismarn and the Oldbury site in South Gloucestershire. Innismarn has a vital role in delivering our nuclear ambitions, and no one should take more credit for today's announcement than my tireless, tenacious and turbocharged honourable friend Innismarn. More investment by large businesses, more support for small businesses, promoting investment in our nations and regions, all part of a budget for long-term growth that sticks to our plan to deliver more jobs, better public services and lower taxes. I now turn to one of the most powerful ways to attract investment, namely supporting our most innovative industries. Outside the US, we have the most respected universities, the biggest financial services sector, and the largest tech ecosystem in Europe. We have double the AI startups of anywhere in Europe, double the venture capital investment, and a tech economy now double the size of Germany and 3 times the size of France. We're on track to become the world's next Silicon Valley. In today's budget for long-term growth, I take further steps to attract investment into our technology-related industries. I want our brilliant tech entrepreneurs not just to start here, but to stay here, including when the time comes for a stock market listing. So we'll build on the Edinburgh and Mansion House reforms to unlock more pension fund capital. We'll give new powers to the Pensions Regulator and Financial Conduct Authority to ensure better value from defined contribution schemes by judging performance on overall returns, not cost. We'll make sure there are vehicles to make it easier for pension funds to invest in UK growth opportunities. So I'm today publishing the names of the winners of the LIFTS competition. But I remain concerned that other markets, such as Australia, generate better returns for pension savers with more effective investment strategies and more investment in high-quality domestic growth stocks. So I will introduce new requirements for DC and local government pension funds to disclose publicly their level of international and UK equity investment, and I'll then consider what further action should be taken if we're not on a positive trajectory towards international best practice. I also want to create opportunities for a new generation of retail investors to engage with public markets. So we'll proceed with the retail sale for part of the government's remaining NatWest shares this summer, at the earliest opportunity, subject to supportive market conditions and value for money. We'll continue to explore how savers could be allowed to take their pension pots with them when they change job. We'll make it easier for people to save for the long term with a new British savings bond delivered through National Savings and Investment, offering savers a guaranteed rate fixed for 3 years. And today, following calls from over 200 representatives of the city and our high-growth sectors, I will reform the ISA system to encourage more people to invest in UK assets. After a consultation on its implementation, I will introduce a brand new British ISA, which will allow an additional £5,000 annual investment for investments in UK equity with all the tax advantages of other ISAs. And this will be on top of the existing ISA allowances, ensure British savers can benefit from the growth of the most promising UK businesses, as well as supporting those businesses with the capital to expand. And I turn now to our other growth industries, starting with clean energy. We want nuclear to provide up to a quarter of our electricity by 2050. And as part of that, I want the UK to lead the global race in developing cutting-edge nuclear technologies. I can therefore announce that Great British Nuclear will begin the next phase of the small modular reactor selection process, with companies now having until June to submit their initial tender responses. Our brilliant Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary will also allocate up to £120 million more to the Green Industries Growth Accelerator to build supply chains for new technology ranging from offshore wind to carbon capture and storage. By January of next year, as promised in the autumn statement, we'll have a new faster connections process to the grid up and running. In advanced manufacturing, we've announced a further £270 million of investment into innovative new automotive and aerospace R&D projects, building the UK's capabilities in zero-emission vehicle and clean aviation technologies. And I now turn to our creative industries. We have become Europe's largest film and TV production centre, with Idris Elba, Keira Knightley and Orlando Bloom all filming their latest productions here. Studio space in the UK has doubled in the last 3 years, and at the current rate of expansion, next year we will be second only to Hollywood globally. In the autumn statement, I committed to providing more tax relief for visual effects in film and high-end TV. I can today confirm that we will increase the rate of tax credit by 5% and remove the 80% cap for visual effects costs in the audiovisual expenditure credit. Having worked closely with the Culture Secretary and listened carefully to representations from companies like Pinewood, Warner Brothers and Sky Studios, we'll provide eligible film studios in England with a 40% relief on their gross business rates until 2034. And having heard representations from the British Film Industry Pact and indeed the Prime Minister, we will introduce a new tax credit for UK independent films with a budget of less than £15 million. For our creative industries more broadly, we will provide £26 million of funding to our preeminent theatre, the National Theatre, to upgrade its stages. And today I particularly want to recognise the contribution of our creative industries and the tourism that comes from orchestras, museums, galleries and theatres. In the pandemic, we introduced higher 45% and 50% levels of tax relief, which were due to end in March 25. They have been a lifeline for performing arts across the country. Today, in recognition of their vital importance to our national life, I can announce I am making those tax reliefs permanent at 45% for touring and orchestral productions and 40% for non-touring productions. Lord Lloyd Webber says this will be a once-in-a-generation transformational change that will ensure Britain remains the global capital of creativity. I suspect the new theatre reliefs may be of particular interest to the Shadow Chancellor, who seems to fancy her thespian skills when it comes to acting like a Tory. The trouble is, we all know how her show ends. Higher taxes, like every Labour government in history. I'm delighted they are cheering the fact that Labour governments always put up taxes. They're right. And I also want to mention our life sciences sector, where we will support research by medical charities into diseases such as cancer, dementia and epilepsy, with an additional £45 million, including £3 million for Cancer Research UK. But I have long believed we should be manufacturing medicines as well as developing them. So I can today also announce a brand new investment by one of our greatest life science companies, AstraZeneca, led by mon ami, the irrepressible Sir Pascal Soriot. AstraZeneca made their COVID vaccine available to developing countries at cost, as a result saving over 6 million lives. And today, because of the government's support for the life sciences sector, they announced plans to invest £650 million in the UK to expand their footprint on the Cambridge Biomedical Campus and fund the building of a vaccine manufacturing hub in Speke in Liverpool. More investment, better jobs in every corner of the country in a long-term budget for growth from a Conservative government. One of the biggest barriers to investment is businesses not being able to hire the staff they need. The economy today has around 900,000 vacancies. It would be easy to fill them with higher migration, but with over 10 million adults of working age who are not in work, that would be economically and morally wrong. Those who can work should. And this is an issue that I have tackled in every budget and autumn statement I've delivered. A year ago, I abolished the pensions lifetime allowance, which pushed doctors and others to take early retirement. Ask any doctor what they think about Labour's plans to bring it back, and they will say, don't go back to square one. In the autumn, with the help of our superb Work and Pensions Secretary, we announced the Back to Work plan, which will support 1 million adults with medical conditions and reduce the number of people assessed as not needing to work by 2/3. A year ago, I also announced the biggest ever expansion of childcare, extending the 30-hour free childcare offer. Just listen. Extending the 30-hour free childcare offer to all children of working parents from 9 months. We've not had a childcare plan from Labour, so you might want to listen to ours. Our plan will mean an extra 60,000 parents enter the workforce in the next 4 years, a tremendous achievement for the Education Secretary, who I think is doing an effing good job. And today, following representations from many people, including the CBI, I announced measures to support the childcare sector make the new investments it now needs to. So I am guaranteeing the rates that will be paid to childcare providers to deliver our landmark offer for children over 9 months old for the next 2 years. That is more people in work, more jobs, sticking to our plan in a long-term budget for growth. And I now turn to public services. I thought they were supposed to be interested in public services. I can wait.
Order. A little bit of murmuring is normal. I shouldn't be able to hear what you're saying over there. That is clearly out of order. Now, let's have some courtesy. Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Good public services need a strong economy to pay for them. But a strong economy also needs good public services. In 2010, schools in the UK were behind Germany, France and Sweden in the OECD's PISA education rankings for reading and maths. Now, after Conservative reforms, we are ahead of them. Burglaries and violent crime have halved in the last 14 years after we invested in 20,000 more police officers. Our armed forces remain the most professional and best funded in Europe. With defence spending already more than 2% of GDP, we're providing more military support to Ukraine than nearly any other country, and our spending will rise to 2.5% as soon as economic conditions allow. The NHS is still recovering from the pandemic, but has 42,000 more doctors and 71,000 more nurses than it did under Labour. That is 250 more doctors and 400 more nurses for every single month that we've been in office. Now, resources matter, of course, which is why, despite all the economic shocks we have faced, overall spending on public services has gone up since 2010, in the case of the NHS by more than 1/3 in real terms. But although spending has continued to rise every year, public sector productivity still remains below pre-pandemic levels by nearly 6%. This demonstrates that the way to improve public services is not always more money or more people. We also need to run them more efficiently. We need a more productive state, not a bigger state. In autumn 2022, I set day-to-day spending to increase by 1% a year in real terms over the next Parliament. Some say that's not enough and we should raise spending by more. Others say it's too much and we should cut it to improve efficiency. Neither are right. It's not fair to ask taxpayers to pay for more when public service productivity has fallen. Nor would it be wise to reduce that funding given the pressures public services face. So I am keeping the planned growth in day-to-day spending at 1% in real terms, but we are going to spend it better. So today, they don't have a plan for public services, like everything else. So why not listen to ours? Today I am announcing a landmark public sector productivity plan that restarts public service reform and changes the Treasury's traditional approach to public spending. And I start with our biggest and most important public service, the NHS. One of my greatest privileges was to be Health Secretary. Thanks to the NHS, I have 3 gorgeous children, the oldest of whom has been patiently listening in the gallery. The NHS is rightly the biggest reason most of us are proud to be British, but the systems that support its staff are often antiquated. Doctors, nurses and ward staff spend hours every day filling out forms when they could be...
Mr. Streeting,
when patients don't show up...
I don't like to interrupt the Chancellor. You're too close to me to be shouting that loudly. If you want to shout that loudly, you should concentrate away up there. I apologise for interrupting the Chancellor.
When patients don't show up, or one member of a team is ill, operating theatres are left empty despite long waiting lists. Now, when we published the NHS long-term workforce plan, I asked the NHS to put together a plan to transform its efficiency and productivity. I wanted better care for patients, more job satisfaction for staff, and better value for taxpayers. Making changes on the scale we need is not cheap. The investment needed to modernise NHS IT systems so they're as good as the best in the world costs £3.4 billion. But it helps unlock £35 billion of savings, 10 times that amount. So in today's budget for long-term growth, I have decided to fund the NHS productivity plan in full. Yeah. With that new investment, we will slash the 13 million hours lost by doctors and nurses every year to outdated IT systems. We will cut down and potentially halve form filling by doctors using AI. We will digitise operating theatre processes, allowing the same number of consultants to do an extra 200,000 operations a year. We'll fund improvements to help doctors read MRI and CT scans more accurately and quickly, speeding up results for 130,000 patients every year and saving thousands of lives, something I know would have delighted my brother Charlie, who I recently lost to cancer. We'll improve the NHS app so it can be used to confirm and modify all appointments, reducing up to half 500,000 missed appointments annually and improving patient choice. We'll set up a new NHS staff app to make it easier to roster electronically and end the use of expensive off-framework agencies. And as a result of this funding, all hospitals will use electronic patient records, making the NHS the largest digitally integrated healthcare system in the world. Today's announcement doubles the amount the NHS is investing on digital transformation over 3 years. And on top of this longer-term transformation, we'll also help the NHS meet pressures in the coming year with an additional £2.5 billion. This will allow the NHS to continue its focus on reducing waiting times and brings the total increase in NHS funding since the start of the Parliament to 13% in real terms. The NHS was there for us in the pandemic, and today, with nearly £6 billion of additional funding, a Conservative government is there for the NHS. The head of the NHS, Amanda Pritchard, today says that this investment shows the government continues to back the NHS. She says that as a result of it, the NHS can commit to delivering 1.9% annual productivity growth over the next Parliament, more than double the average productivity growth in public services between 2010 and 2019. But today is not just about the NHS. I want this groundbreaking agreement with the NHS to be a model for all our public services. Across education, the police, the courts and local government, I want to see more efficient, better value and higher quality public services. So today I can announce that in the next spending review, the Treasury will do things differently. We will prioritise proposals that deliver annual savings within 5 years, equivalent to the total cost of the investment required. And today we make a start with some excellent proposals. Violence reduction units and hotspot policing have prevented an estimated 136,000 knife crimes and other violent offences, as well as over 3,000 hospital admissions. Every crime costs money, so we will provide £75 million to roll that model out in England and Wales. Police officers waste around 8 hours a week on unnecessary admin. With higher productivity, we could free the equivalent of 20,000 police officers over a year. So we will spend £230 million rolling out time and money-saving technology, which speeds up police response times by allowing people to report crimes by video call and, where appropriate, use drones as first responders. Too many legal cases, particularly in family law, should never go to court, and it would cost us less if they didn't. So we'll spend £170 million to fund non-court resolution, reduce reoffending and digitise the court process. Too many children in care end up being looked after by unregistered providers that are much more expensive. So we'll invest £165 million over the next 4 years to reduce that cost by increasing the capacity of the Children's Homes estate. Special education need provision can be excellent when outsourced to independent sector schools, but also expensive. So we'll invest £105 million over the next 4 years to build 50 new special free schools to create additional high-quality places and increase choice for parents. And we'll also put in place a plan to realise the tens of billions of savings recommended in an excellent speech by the head of the National Audit Office. The OBR say a 5% increase in public sector productivity would be the equivalent of around £20 billion in extra funding. With these plans, we can deliver that and more. And if we ensure they are cash-releasing savings, as we are committed to doing, it will be possible to live with more constrained spending growth without cutting services valued by the public. So with the energy and drive of my talented Chief Secretary to the Treasury, we launch our public sector productivity plan in today's budget for long-term growth, more investment, more jobs, better public services, and one more thing, lower taxes. Keeping taxes down matters to Conservatives in a way it never can for Labour. We believe that in a free society, the money you earn doesn't belong to the government, it belongs to you. And if we want to encourage hard work, we should let people keep as much of their own money as possible. Conservatives look around the world at economies in North America and Asia and notice that countries with lower taxes generally have higher growth. Now, economists argue about cause and correlation, but we know that lower taxed economies have more energy, more dynamism and more innovation, and we know that's Britain's future too. Before I explain how we will bring down taxes, I start with some measures to make our system simpler and fairer. To discourage non-smokers from taking up vaping, we're today confirming the introduction of an excise duty on vaping products from October 26 and publishing a consultation on its design. Because vapes can also play a positive role in helping people quit smoking, we'll introduce a one-off increase in tobacco duty at the same time to maintain the financial incentive to choose vaping over smoking. I'll make a one-off adjustment to rates of air passenger duty on non-economy flights only to account for high inflation in recent years, and I'll provide HMRC with the resources they need to ensure everyone pays the tax they owe, leading to an increase in revenue collected of over £4.5 billion across the forecast period. Next, I turn to property taxation. In recent months, following tenacious representation from the honourable members for St Austell and Newquay, North Devon, cities of London and Westminster, Torbay and Truro and Falmouth, I have been looking closely at our furnished holiday lettings tax regime. I am concerned that this tax regime is creating a distortion, meaning there are not enough properties available for long-term rental by local people. So to make the tax system work better for local communities, I'm going to abolish the furnished holiday lettings regime. I've also been looking at stamp duty relief for people who purchase more than one dwelling in a single transaction, known as multiple dwellings relief. I see the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party paying close attention, given her multiple dwellings.
Order. Too much excitement. We haven't actually heard, because we can't hear what the Chancellor is trying to say. OK, and I can hear who is shouting there. You won't get to speak later. Chancellor.
I'm sorry to disappoint her, but multiple dwellings relief was not actually designed for her, but intended to... It was intended to support investment in the private rented sector, but an external evaluation found no strong evidence that it had done so and that it was being regularly abused, so I'm going to abolish it. And finally, as part of this budget, both the Treasury, a part of our look on property taxation, both the Treasury and the OBR have looked at the costs associated with our current levels of capital gains tax on property. They have concluded that if we reduced the higher 28% rate that exists for residential property, we would in fact increase revenues because there would be more transactions. For the first time in history, both the Treasury and the OBR have discovered their inner Laffer curve. So today I'm going to reduce the higher rate of property capital gains tax from 28% to 24%. That really is for you, Angela.
I had enough from over there, definitely not having it from here. Chancellor.
I now turn to oil and gas. Unlike the party opposite, we want to encourage investment in the North Sea, so we will retain generous investment allowances for the sector. We'll also legislate in the finance bill to abolish the energy profits levy should market prices fall to their historic norm for a sustained period of time, after representations from the honourable member for Banff and Buchan. But because the increase in energy prices caused by the Ukraine war is expected to last longer, so too will the sector's windfall profits. So I will extend the sunset on the energy profits levy for an additional year to 2029, raising £1.5 billion. Next, I turn to the taxes paid by those who are resident in the UK but not domiciled here for tax purposes. This is a category of people known as non-doms. Now, Nigel Lawson wanted to end the non-dom regime in his great tax reforming budget of 1988, which is where I suspect the Labour Party got the idea from. But I, too, have always believed that provided we protect the UK's attractiveness to international investors, those with the broadest shoulders should pay their fair share. After looking at the issue over many months, I've concluded that we can indeed introduce a system which is both fairer and remains competitive with other countries. So the government will abolish the current tax system for non-doms, get rid of the outdated concept of domicile, and I aim to please all sides of the House in all my budgets. And we will replace...
Order. This is impossible. Right? Can you just... Order! Could you please shout more quietly? Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We will replace the non-dom regime with a modern, simpler and fairer residency-based system. From April 25, new arrivals to the UK will not be required to pay any tax on foreign income and gains for their first 4 years of UK residency, a more generous regime than at present and one of the most attractive offers in Europe. But after 4 years, those who continue to live in the UK will pay the same tax as other UK residents. Recognising the contribution of many of these individuals to our economy, we will put in place transitional arrangements for those benefiting from the current regime. That will include a 2-year period in which individuals will be encouraged to bring wealth earned overseas to the UK, where it can be spent and invested here, a measure that will attract onshore an additional £15 billion of foreign income and generate more than £1 billion of extra tax. Overall, abolishing non-dom status will raise £2.7 billion a year by the end of the forecast period. That is money the party opposite planned to use for spending increases, but today a Conservative government makes a different choice. We use that revenue to help cut taxes on working families. And many of those families, Madam Deputy Speaker, depend on child benefit. But the way we treat child benefit in the tax system is confusing and unfair. It's a lifeline for many parents because it helps with the additional costs associated with having children. And when it works, it's good for children, good for parents, and good for the economy because it helps people into work. But we currently withdraw child benefit when one parent earns over £50,000 a year. That means two parents earning £49,000 a year receive the benefit in full, but a household earning a lot less than that does not, if just one parent earns over £50,000. Today, I set out plans to end that unfairness. Doing so requires significant reform to the tax system, including allowing HMRC to collect household-level information. We'll therefore consult on moving the high-income child benefit charge to a household-based system to be introduced by April 2026. But because that is not a quick fix, I make two changes today to make the current system fairer. Following representations from my right honourable friends from Penistone and Stocksbridge, Carshalton and Wallington, Bassetlaw and West Worcestershire, along with many others, I confirm that from this April, the high-income child benefit charge threshold will be raised from £50,000 to £60,000. We will raise the top of the taper, at which it's withdrawn, to £80,000. That means no one earning under £60,000 will pay the charge, taking 170,000 families out of paying it altogether. And because of the higher taper and threshold, nearly 500,000 families with children will save an average of £1,300 next year. According to the OBR, this change will see an increase in hours amongst those already working to the equivalent of 10,000 more people entering the workforce. More investment, more jobs, better public service and lower tax. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is one further set of changes I want to make today. The way we tax people's income is particularly unfair. If you get your income from having a job, you pay two types of tax: national insurance contributions and income tax. If you get it from other sources, you pay only one. This double taxation of work is unfair. The result is a complicated system that penalises work instead of encouraging it. If we are to build a high-wage, high-skill economy not dependent on migration, if we want to encourage people not in work to come back to work, we need a simpler, fairer tax system that makes work pay. That is why I cut national insurance contributions in the autumn. By reducing the penalty on work, the OBR said that tax cut would lead to the equivalent of 94,000 more people in work. In other words, it would fill more than 1 in 10 vacancies throughout the economy. Lower taxes, more jobs and higher growth. Today, because of the progress we have made bringing down inflation, because of the additional investment that is flowing into the economy, because we have a plan for better and more efficient public services, and because we have asked those with the broadest shoulders to pay a bit more.
Order. Mr. Perkins. I can manage, thank you very much. 5 times I've heard what you said. I let you away with it. Now that's enough. One more strike and you're out.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do know how hard it is for them to listen to arguments for lower taxes. But that is the difference. Because we have asked those with the broadest shoulders to pay a bit more, today I go further. From April the 6th, employee national insurance will be cut by another 2p from 10% to 8%. And self-employed national insurance will be cut from 8% to 6%. It means an additional £450 a year for the average employee, or £350 for someone self-employed. When combined with the autumn reductions, it means 27 million employees will get an average tax cut of £900 a year. 2 million self-employed will get a tax cut averaging £650. Changes that make our system simpler and fairer, and changes that grow our economy by rewarding work. The OBR say, when combined with the autumn reduction, our national insurance cuts will mean the equivalent of 200,000 more people in work, filling 1 in 5 vacancies, adding 0.4% to GDP and 0.4% to GDP per head. This is the second fiscal event where we've reduced employee and self-employed national insurance. We've cut it by 1/3 in 6 months, without increasing borrowing and without cutting spending on public services. That means the average earner in the UK now has the lowest effective personal tax rate since 1975. Their effective taxes are now lower than in America, France, Germany or any G7 country, because Conservatives believe that making work pay is of the most fundamental importance, because we believe that the double taxation of work is unfair. Our long-term ambition is to end this unfairness when it is responsible, when it can be achieved without increasing borrowing, when it can be delivered without compromising high-quality public services. We will continue to cut national insurance as we have done today, so we truly make work pay. Madam Deputy Speaker, we stick to our plan with a budget for long-term growth. It delivers more investment, more jobs, better public services and lower taxes. But dynamism in an economy doesn't come from ministers in Whitehall. It comes from the grit and determination of people who take risks, work hard and innovate. Not government policies, but people power. It is to unleash people power that we today put this country back on the path to lower taxes. A plan to grow the economy versus no plan. A plan for better public services versus no plan. A plan to make work pay versus no plan. Growth up, jobs up, taxes down. I commend this statement to the House.
So Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has just sat down after more than an hour of that budget speech in which he confirmed what we'd widely expected in terms of a further 2p cut in national insurance. We will go into more of the detail of what he unveiled in just a moment, but soon the leader, I should say, of the opposition, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, will stand up and give his response to what we have just heard. In fact, there was really pretty well nothing that hadn't been trailed before this budget today. Everything that was announced by Jeremy Hunt we had heard about, but there was a lot more detail on things like an NHS productivity plan. There may be questions about why that hadn't come into place beforehand, but he said the money that would be invested, nearly £3.5 billion into IT and AI, would make massive savings of £35 billion. And the increase that had been penciled in public spending of 1%, well, that is to stay. There had been concerns that that increase might be reduced. You can see Dame Eleanor Lang, the Deputy Speaker there, trying to resume order before Keir Starmer stands up and gives his response. Throughout, Jeremy Hunt pointedly said that under any Labour government, taxes always went up. But even with these cuts in national insurance, 2p in the autumn statement and another 2p announced today, the overall tax burden is still expected to go up because of the continuation of the freezing of tax thresholds. When people earn more, they get dragged into a higher tax threshold. So let me just remind you briefly of those budget main measures. 2p reduction in national insurance, as we have discussed and was widely expected. Day-to-day spending increase kept at 1% above inflation. Windfall tax on oil and gas extended, as predicted. Non-dom status to be abolished. Well, he's got a different regime that is going to be put into place, stealing some of Labour's thunder. And the child benefit salary threshold is increased. That has always been seen as an unfair anomaly. Let's see and go through some of the others. The tax on vapes, an increase in tobacco duty. They are part of the measures to raise money to fund the tax cut. Fuel and alcohol duty freeze is extended. There is also the announcement from Jeremy Hunt, as I was saying, about some of the changes he is going to make and reforms he is going to make to get more people back into work. It was seen as one of the biggest issues that he wanted to tackle when he made his autumn statement. He said that the national insurance cut, accordingly, would put 94,000 people back into work. That was in the autumn, and that this cut today would result in 200,000 more people into work, and that would lead to an improvement in growth. Now, interestingly, there is a division, it looks like, in the House of Commons that Dame Eleanor Lang has allowed. So there is going to be a brief pause before we actually hear the response from the Labour leader. I don't quite know if we can go into the chamber to see what's happening, but we will keep an eye on that and see what's happening. Chris, I don't know exactly what's caused Eleanor Nang to call a division, but as we can see, MPs are dispersing there from the House unless there was a point of order that resulted in it.
Yeah, I'm just trying to establish exactly what has happened here. Eleanor Nang was just watching the screens as you were running through some of the main budget measures, was gesticulating in a rather animated manner. Quite often there's a little bit of parliamentary jiggery-pokery that goes on between a Chancellor sitting down and the Leader of the Opposition standing up, but clearly in this instance there's rather more than there would be usually.
I'm just hearing that it's the SNP that have forced a vote on the first budget resolution. Now, normally these things are just a formality. There is usually a brief changeover from the end of the Chancellor's statement on the budget before we hear the Leader of the Opposition. But they have managed to force a vote. So we will have to keep across exactly what is happening. That will delay hearing from Sir Keir Starmer, and we'll get the details of precisely what the SNP have decided to call a vote on, and when we can, we will obviously talk about it. But first of all, a response. It was a very long statement from the Chancellor in which he announced pretty well everything that had been trailed and that we had predicted. There were slightly better growth figures, and he talked about borrowing coming down more quickly than perhaps had been forecast. And very importantly, the spending on public services, that 1%, is staying the same. What did you make of it overall?
So I think that is a key point, because there was a lot of discussion before about the prospect of the spending being penciled in for future years going down from a figure that already plenty felt was perhaps unrealistic, particularly for those departments that are not offered any elements of sort of ring fencing or protection. So I think that will be seized upon because it's something different from what we were perhaps anticipating. And then I think, particularly if you only caught the last 10 or 15 minutes of the Chancellor's statement, you got the two sides of the ledger in many senses. So you got the tax raising measures across a platter of different chunks of the economy, depending on where your interests might lie. So the excise duty on vaping, rise in tobacco duty, posh seats on planes costing more, holiday homes, stamp duty relief around multiple dwellings, capital gains tax on property, and indeed the non-dom stuff, all of which adding up very roughly to something that allows the Chancellor to argue that he can sustainably, reasonably and responsibly afford a second 2p cut in national insurance to match the one that we got in the autumn statement. But where there was some expectation that he might go further, perhaps with an extra penny there or an income tax, that didn't happen. And so, in summary, as you say, Joe, there's a huge amount of detail still to go through in the documents and all the rest of it, but in big ticket headline terms, what we've been talking about in the last couple of days is broadly what we have since heard in the last hour.
In terms of the state of the economy, it is, as we discussed beforehand, and it's just interesting watching Jeremy Hunt stand there going into all the detail that he could in terms of pockets of money going here, pockets of money going there. It's so clear that this is an election year and possibly the last budget, at least. There may be another fiscal event, but the last budget. And there was no big surprise at the end.
There wasn't any big surprise. However, the cut to national insurance is significant when you add it together. There has been some criticism in some quarters about the kind of closeness with which Mr Hunt has developed the budget with his official forecast, the Office for Budget Responsibility. You can see why he did it. They have given him significant credit for some of the policies. Indeed, it's almost like some of the policies were designed to get that credit. So, for example, this cut in national insurance overall, it's quite something to say and that it's going to create 200,000 more jobs. It's going to bump up growth by 0.4% of the economy. Definitely take that. You know, he had quite a bad hand in terms of the fact that the recession was just called a month before his budget, and you got the turn in terms of borrowing costs. So what he's done is he's tried to focus on measures that get some return in the economy, number one. Number two, he's also sought to address this issue about, if you like, a blank set of spending plans. He hasn't kind of filled in those details, but he's come up with an argument that AI and drones and all sorts of automation
but we have heard a lot
can mean that you can spend less and that can provide the foundation for permanent tax cuts. So that's his argument. A smaller state driven by technology and therefore smaller taxes.
But politically, Chris, is this going to change anything in terms of the government's fortunes? Are Tory MPs going to be cheering this particular budget in terms of what they may need to take to the doorstep? If that 2p cut in national insurance in the autumn didn't do it, how are they going to make another 2p cut? Not insignificant, I take what you say, Faisal, worth perhaps £900 a year in terms of the average worker, but will it change anything politically?
Well, certainly the fear from a lot of Conservative MPs, almost irrespective of what the Chancellor said today, was that such is the political and economic backdrop that we were talking about an hour or so ago, that he couldn't possibly do anything that would fundamentally shift the dial. I think what's interesting is yes, you can make an argument that says he's sort of rerunning the autumn argument around national insurance, and if it didn't move the dial politically then, why will it this time? Well, there is a doubling of the cut.
Yeah.
So maybe it will. Maybe it can.
And also, he said he was going to continue to cut national insurance.
And you saw very clearly, I think, at the end there, how the Chancellor and the Conservatives are trying to frame and shape what they see as the distinguishing differences between themselves and the Labour Party as far as political instinct is concerned, whilst also trying to raise some awkward questions for Labour, because we've heard, and I think we'll have it confirmed from Keir Starmer when he speaks in the next 5 or 10 minutes, that Labour will back those cuts in national insurance. So when they make an argument about the Conservatives leaving a tricky situation for them economically, they're making choices now, Labour, about what they're going to back and what they're not, and in so doing will have to make choices down the track as a result of the inevitable consequence, the trade-off there.
Paul Johnson is with us from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Welcome to you. One of the things that you said recently was that if there were any more cuts, tax cuts, cuts to national insurance, you'd want to see where the cuts were going to be in public spending. Now, we heard today that he's going to keep that 1% increase penciled in. Did you get any sense, any further sense of where the axe might fall?
No, I mean the 1% a year increase in public spending doesn't sound too bad, but given what we know will happen to health spending and defence spending and childcare spending and so on, that will mean really quite big cuts in everything else. And those are the things that got cuts last time round: police, justice, social care, local government, all those kinds of things which are struggling. So what we got again today was tax cuts today, paid for by some completely uncertain spending plans for the future. Now, the Chancellor did talk a lot about public sector productivity. It's definitely the right thing to focus on, but he seemed to be suggesting he could find £20 billion worth of savings there. Well, we'll wait and see whether that is really feasible. I'm sceptical.
You're sceptical. I mean, what did he say? An investment of nearly £3.5 billion for 35 billion, I thought he said, pounds of savings in the future at some point.
Well, the National Health Service definitely needs investment in IT and so on, and one of the reasons that its productivity has collapsed actually over recent years is that it hasn't had that kind of investment over the last decade or more, and indeed its IT systems don't need to be got to world class, they just need to be got to just about adequate. That would be a good start.
Right. I mean, he talked about turning the corner on inflation, and the figures back that up. We are turning a corner. He said in order to turn the corner soon, or we will soon turn the corner on growth, an admission there that obviously the economy is in recession at the moment after 2 negative quarters of growth at the end of last year.
Yes, I mean, it's worse than 2 negative quarters of growth, really, because on a per-person basis, we've been getting poorer for 2 years, not 2 quarters, because the population has been growing whilst growth has essentially been completely stagnant over that period. Now, it looks like the OBR is forecasting a little bit of growth this year and then some more growth into the future. So the OBR's handed him a slightly better growth outlook, but actually that reduced inflation in some ways is bad news for him because it means less money coming in, and it's actually the sort of cash size of the economy that matters, and that's one reason why his his fiscal headroom at the end of the Parliament, if anything, is a little bit worse, not better.
Yeah,
not at the end of the Parliament, at the end of the forecast.
Yes, is slightly less, sticking within those fiscal rules. He did list some of the things that he's going to do in terms of increasing taxes, raising money perhaps to partly fund this 2p cut, the tax on vapes, which we expected, and also getting rid of some of the tax relief for people with holiday lets. There was something on air passenger duty. Is this all going to add up, do you think, to enough in terms of funding what has been billed as a £10 billion cut?
Well, those together aren't enough for
No.
£10 billion, and indeed that's why he's sort of lost £5 billion or so in headroom at the end. So he's paying for some of it simply by having more debt or a smaller reduction in debt than he'd intended at the end of the period. And some of the numbers there are quite uncertain. Exactly how much we'll get from non-DOMs, we don't really know, but it's only a couple of billion in any case.
Right. I mean, it is still the question, will people feel better off? Will they feel better off having received, if you're working, another 2p off your national insurance when overall the predicted forecast overall tax burden is still set to go up?
Well, it is worth saying that for people on average earnings are in the sort of £25,000 to £50,000 range, you take those 4p in total off national insurance, they will be in tax terms better off after this April than they were at the beginning of the Parliament, simply in terms of personal taxes. So they have lost from the income tax rises, but they've gained more from those national insurance cuts. Now, people on lower earnings will be worse off, people on higher earnings
but the
will
middle
be worse off. But if you look at incomes in total, the OBR have got a chart showing what they think is going to happen to people's overall average incomes. They're still going to be no higher at the end of this Parliament than they were at the beginning. Now, that is pretty remarkable. OBR have got a little bit more optimistic than they were in the autumn, but they're still not suggesting that we will be any better off at the end of this year than we were at the end of 2019.
Faisal?
Yeah, I'm intrigued. So he talked quite, given what we reported before about the growth of GDP per capita, as well as GDP, he said, well, it's going up. And it's pretty balanced this year, just minus 0.1, but then it does go up. You know, the picture, what's happened is that the forecasters have started to believe we're going to get back to sort of relatively normal rates of growth after next year, just under 2% for the next 4 or 5 years. That does a lot for him, and maybe changes the tone about the next Parliament, whoever ends up in power. Also, we're just leafing through the numbers here. That's what we're doing here. We've got the red budget book here. We've got the blue Office of Budget Responsibility kind of forecasts there. I mean, and as you expect, it's a giveaway budget with the giveaway front-loaded. Surprise, surprise, for this year ahead of an election. £14 billion giveaway in the next year. And that tapers down to 12, 9, 7, and then 6 billion at the end of the forecasts. So the overwhelming story here, in terms of the moves, is that 10 billion cut to national insurance, that further cut to national insurance. And I guess one of the suspicions I had about this budget was whether immediately after it finished, whether we'd be thinking, if he really wanted to make a big statement and there was a directional steer that he wanted to cut national insurance even more.
Well, there was that directional steer.
Yeah. That maybe there's another fiscal statement here. There's space for another fiscal statement. The forecasts get a bit better. I think Paul would argue you shouldn't spend an increase in the forecast. That's a bad way to run things. But immediately ahead of an election, maybe a month or two ahead of an election,
well,
maybe that's where we're heading.
Well, we'll talk about the timing. Just hold. Here's Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There we have it, the last desperate act of a party that has failed. Britain in recession, the national credit card maxed out, and despite the measures today, the highest tax burden for 70 years. The first Parliament since records began to see living standards fall, confirmed by this budget today. That is their record. It is still their record. Give with one hand and take even more with the other. And nothing they do between now and the election will change that. I mean, over 14 years, we've seen our fair share of delusion from the party opposite. A Prime Minister who thinks the cost of living crisis is starting to ease. An Education Secretary who thinks concrete crumbling on our children deserves her gratitude. A former Prime Minister who still believes crashing the pound was the right path for Britain.
Where is she?
And today, a new entry in this hall of infamy, the Chancellor, who breezes into this chamber in a recession and tells the working people of this country that everything's on track. Crisis? What crisis? Or, as the captain of the Titanic and the former Prime Minister herself might have said, iceberg? What iceberg? Smiling as the ship goes down, the Chuckle Brothers of decline, dreaming of Santa Monica, or maybe just a quiet life in Surrey, not having to self-fund his election, whilst the crew behind them scrabble for DB News budget. If only it weren't so serious, because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the story of this Parliament is devastatingly simple. A Conservative party stubbornly clinging to the failed ideas of the past, completely unable to generate the growth working people need, and forced by that failure to ask them to pay more and more for less and less. And as the desperation grows, they torch not only their reputation for fiscal responsibility, but any notion that they can serve the country, not themselves. Party first, country second, while working people pay the price. Food prices still 25% higher than they were 2 years ago. Rents up 10%. An extra £240 a month for a typical family remortgaging this year, because they lost control of the economy, they sent interest rates through the roof, they made working people pay. They should be under no illusion. That record is how the British people will judge today's cuts, because the whole country can see exactly what is happening here. They recognise a Tory con when they see it, just as they did in November. Give with one hand, take even more with the other. Madam Deputy Speaker, people have been living through this nonsense for 14 years. They know the thresholds are still frozen, dragging more and more people into higher taxes. They know that a Tory stealth tax is coming their way in the shape of their next council tax bill. The Levelling Up Secretary has told not just this House, but every house in the country he's coming for their council tax. Give with one hand, gove in the other. But most insultingly of all, the British people know the only cause that gets this lot out of bed is trying to save their own skin. Take the desperate move, after years of resistance, to finally accept Labour's argument on the non-dom tax regime. Has there ever been a more obvious example of a government that is totally bereft of ideas? And if they're sincere in support of this policy now, then the question they must answer today is, why did they not do it earlier? Why did they not stand up to their friends, their funders and their family? Because if they had followed Labour's example, 3.8 million extra operations would have taken place by now. 1.3 million emergency dental appointments, 3 breakfast clubs for nearly 4.5 million children. But if, instead, this is just another short-term, cynical political gimmick, then honestly, what is the point of them? What is the point of a party that is out of touch, out of ideas, and nearly out of road? And we saw it last year as well, when only Labour's policies on the cost of living made the difference. For those opposite, now a little downbeat about another intellectual triumph for social democracy, I say, get used to it, because with this pair in charge, it won't be long before they ask you to defend the removal of private school tax relief as well. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the harder they try with cynical games like this, the worse it will get for them, because the whole country can see exactly who they are, fighting for themselves, politics not governing, party first, country second. Madam Deputy Speaker, because we have campaigned to lower the tax burden on working people for the whole Parliament, and we won't stop now, we will support the cuts to national insurance today. But I noticed this. In 2022, when the Prime Minister was Chancellor, he made this promise. I can confirm in 2024, for the first time, the basic rate of income tax will be cut from 20 to 19 pence. Having briefed that all week that an income tax was coming, that promise is in tatters today. And of course, we support the fresh investment in our NHS, although I have to note that the Chancellor, when he was Health Secretary 10 years ago, promised to make the NHS paperless by 2018. And I know the Prime Minister's fondness for Elon Musk extends to an enthusiastic embrace of his community notes on fact-checking, so I'll say this bit slowly. Labour supports the fuel duty freeze. That is our policy, and I look forward to the Prime Minister's acknowledgement of that in coming days. We do ask the Chancellor and can set out how we will make sure that this policy gets passed on to hard-pressed families at the pump. Yet, Madam Deputy Speaker, for all the fanfare around the tax measures today, that straightforward story remains true. Taxes, a 70-year high. The British people paying more for less. An unprecedented hit to living standards of working people. The first time they've gone backwards over a parliament, and they were cheering that today. And the reason is equally simple. There is no plan for growth. How can there be? He can say long-term plan all he likes. We see there are... Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, last year he announced 110 growth measures. He said we've turned the corner. And where are we now? Britain in recession. An economy smaller than when the Prime Minister entered Downing Street. The textbook definition of decline, that is their record. I mean, after 14 years, who do they actually think feels better off? Productivity is flat. Mortgages through the roof. House building off a cliff. Worklessness rising and rising. Homelessness never higher. Crime virtually unpunished. Children who can't see a dentist. Sewage in our rivers. Billions and billions of taxpayers' money wasted. 7 billion by the Prime Minister on COVID fraud alone. 500 million on the Rwanda scheme that has achieved precisely nothing. I can keep going. A railway line that will never reach our great northern cities. In fact, it might not even reach central London. Billions upon billions for a white elephant without a trunk. While today we learn taxpayers are picking up the bill for the Science Minister's libel. And all the time, one thing that is growing, the waiting list in our NHS, now nearly 8 million. They've had 14 years. 14 years running out of road. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is what decline looks like. And the complacency they've shown today, it takes your breath away. Britain deserves better than this. Britain deserves a real plan for growth, an end to 14 years of stagnation, wealth creation across the whole of the country, higher living standards for working people. This is the mission we need. But yet again, what we got was the same tired old formula, the sticking plasters, the chopping and changing, the party first, country second politics, with no repudiation of the utterly discredited idea that economic growth is something the few gift to the many. But even then, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think his backbenchers are owed an explanation. Because when the Chancellor says Britain has grown more quickly than countries like Germany over the last 14 years, I'm sure they will be shocked to learn that this is a statistical sleight of hand. And when it comes to GDP per capita, in other words, the growth that makes the difference to the pockets of working people, their record is much worse. Indeed, In per capita terms, our economy has not grown since the first quarter of 2022, the longest period of stagnation Britain has seen since 1955. In fact, the Chancellor invited us to look at those figures. The OBR says GDP per capita will be 0.75% lower in 2028 than was they forecast in November of last year. That was the number he said we should watch. 0.75% lower in 2028. And they can call this a technical recession, but there's nothing technical about working people living in recession for every second the Prime Minister has been in power. This is a Rishi recession. And if the party opposite really wants to know what hides in the Chancellor's spreadsheets, then they will see that it's only the record levels of migration they have delivered which has prevented an even deeper decline. And that is the record they must stand on at the election. Because while on these benches we do not demean for a second the contribution migrants make to a thriving economy, it is high time the party opposite was honest with the British public about the role migration plays in their economic policy. Because right now, in terms of growth, that is all they have. There is nothing else. No plan to get Britain building again with a reformed planning system. No ambition to invest in clean British power for cheaper bills and energy security. No inclination to move away from insecure, low-paid jobs and strengthen employment rights so we can finally make work pay. Madam Deputy Speaker, where is the urgency on affordable housing? How can they look at Britain now and not see this as a massive priority? Never again will they be allowed to pose as the party of home ownership and aspiration. I have to say, given the disaster that's befallen his childcare plans, perhaps that's for the best. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the cost of childcare is a huge challenge for millions. Parents need him to deliver on his promise. And it seems the Chancellor's been taking lessons on marketing from the Willy Wonka experience in Glasgow. All is not as it seems. And with just over 3 weeks to go, he has to come clean. Because up and down the country, parents need to know, will they get their entitlement in April, or is it just another of their reckless promises on governing? Headlines over delivery, promises without plans. Policies that unravel at the first contact with reality. The lesson crystal clear that those who broke our economy cannot be trusted to repair it. The Tory credit rating is 0. It's time for change with Labour. And that's what today's budget should have been about. A last chance for the government to show it understands the economic reality of our volatile world. That global supply chains can be weaponised by tyrants like Putin, that a sticking-plaster approach to public investment will cost Britain more in the long run, and that trickle-down nonsense means working people pay the price. It could even have been a moment of contrition, a reflection on their fiscal recklessness, an apology, perhaps, for the ridiculous chaos they've inflicted on businesses, communities and investors in this country. And yet still no sustainable industrial strategy, still no national wealth fund to crowd in private investment, still no urgency on speeding up critical infrastructure projects, and no recognition that they have left our standing as a country that always keeps its promises in tatters. And if they don't like that accusation, then look no further than the grotesque spectacle of ducking their responsibility to the victims of infected blood and Horizon scandal. One of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our nation's history. Those were the Prime Minister's words just 2 months ago. Today, justice kicked beyond the general election. No, Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain can see exactly who they are. And the reality is there is no path to economic stability, no way to a calmer, less chaotic politics with the party opposite in power, because chaos is now their worldview, a mindset that sees Britain's problems as opportunities they can exploit. Whether, like the Chancellor, that's out of desperation because they can't solve them, or whether, like the members for Fareham or South West Norfolk, they have no intention of solving them whatsoever. For a party this weak and divided, the end result is always the same. A vicious downward spiral. Chaos feeding off decline, decline feeding off chaos, while working people pay the price. The British people know this will not stop. 5 more years and it will only get worse. There will be no change of direction without a change of government. And that leaves Britain a nation in limbo, unable to shake off the Tory chaos that dragged us into recession and loaded the tax burden onto the backs of working people and maxed out the nation's credit card. Britain deserves a government ready to take tough decisions, give our public services an immediate cash injection, stick to fiscal rules without complaint, fight for the living standards of working people and deliver a sustainable plan for growth. So we say to the Chancellor and Prime Minister, it's time to break the habit of 14 years, stop the dithering, stop the delay, stop the uncertainty and confirm May the 2nd as the date of the next general election, because Britain deserves better and Labour are ready.
Well, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, ending his response to Jeremy Hunt's budget statement by throwing down the gauntlet and saying, confirm the date of the general election on May the 2nd. In other words, an earlier election than we had expected the Prime Minister to call, because he's always indicated it would be towards the end of the year in the autumn. There is, of course, in theory, still time to call that early election. But Keir Starmer has said that this government has broken the economy, that living standards are lower at the end of this Parliament, or will be, than at the start, and that the Conservatives have left our standing as a country in tatters, ducking the responsibilities to the victims of the Horizon scandal and also the infected blood scandal, and then saying that's why we need a change in government and call the election. Well, until that is called, we welcome Laura Trott, who is the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and sitting next to Jeremy Hunt during that budget. The headline was very much what we'd expected, another 2p cut in national insurance. You could have made a different decision. You could have used some of what we call that headroom to actually go into public services. Why did you make a different choice and go for cutting national insurance?
Well, we've seen a huge amount of investment in public services just from today. You know, we saw NHS is getting over £5 billion. 2.5 billion pounds next year. This is significant investment. We also saw a significant investment through the public sector productivity programme in special educational needs schools, in police. But what we have done more broadly is taken the public through a very difficult time, right? We spent £400 billion during COVID, £100 billion supporting people through the energy price shock. But we've had to take difficult decisions. But because of the plan, the economy is turning a corner. And now we're able to give working people back some of their money through tax cuts.
As you say, some of their money, because the overall tax burden is still going up. And we have to be honest with voters and with the electorate. Let's just show the graph here. Tax as a percentage of GDP. So despite what was announced today and despite what was announced in the autumn statement, you can see there that by 2028-29, the forecast, the figures from the Office for Budget Responsibility, it's still going to reach that record high. Tax levels at 37.1%. Taxes are going up.
Because of the steps that we've taken in the fiscal events, over the last 4 fiscal events, it's 0.6% lower than it would have been. But I'm not shying away from the fact, Joe, I'm absolutely not.
Right.
From the fact we
so
have
you
taken
can stay clear to everyone,
decisions.
tax is going up, overall tax burden is rising and will continue to do so.
But think about the individual people within that. We've always said, the people with the broadest shoulders, we are asking to take most of the burden. And then we're doing that in order to allow working people to have a lower tax burden. Someone on the national living wage, their taxes will be 35%, their take-home pay will be 35% higher than it would have been otherwise. And that is really important. The distributional impacts of this are very different.
But all you're doing is you are giving back, as you quite rightly said, some of what you've taken away. Because of those tax thresholds having been frozen over a considerable amount of time, anyone who earns any more money gets dragged into higher rates of tax, and they are far bigger across the board than what you are giving them back in national insurance cuts. In fact, we looked at some of the figures, and the combined effect of a 4% cut in national insurance and the threshold freezes between 2021 and this April would mean that people earning less than £25,000 are worse off.
I think it's important that we look at this over a longer
But is that
period. True? Well, I think the average earner has the lowest effective tax rate now since 1975. Right, that is a really important thing. So it is, and for people, as I said, on the lowest money, on the national living wage, you know, they are 35% better off since 2010.
But if you earn less than £25,000, average wage, you are worse off. So when people are asked, do you feel better off or do you feel worse off as a result of Conservative governments, they won't just feel worse off, they are worse off.
That's not true since 2010. I think that's really important. Well, that's not true since... And we did some huge personal, in terms of the basic rate, increasing that, the income tax threshold. It is like, so that is the difference. Because we made those big changes in the tax-free threshold at the beginning.
Shall we have a look at that? You say that, but let's have a look at that graph again. Tax as a percentage of GDP. Since 2010, taxes have gone up.
Yes. I agree with you in terms of the overall tax burden.
Well, that's what we're looking at.
No, but absolutely. I've been very clear at the beginning. We had to make some difficult decisions. We spent £400 billion during COVID. We have to pay that back. That is a fundamental Conservative principle. We've had to do things that, as a Conservative, I feel very uncomfortable doing. But we've always asked those with the broader shoulders to take the biggest burden, and we are trying to give back now because our plan is working, because inflation is falling, because real wages are rising. We are able now to cut working people's taxes.
All right, one of the things that, in fact, we just had the Institute for Fiscal Studies head here, Paul Johnson, one of the things he wanted to know, even before the budget, is that public services, some public services, are going to be squeezed quite dramatically, he thinks, and he wanted to know where is the axe going to fall. You're keeping a 1% increase above inflation, but of course that's across all public services. Some will get more and others will get cut. Where are you going to cut?
So you're very right to point out that the overall size of the pie will be going up. This is not austerity. The amount that we are increasing.
Well, how do we know unless we know what you're going to cut?
Well, because the overall kind of the planned cuts from 2010 to 2015 was minus 2.1%. Right, so this is going up. Resource spending is going up by 1% overall. So it's very important that people at home know that it's increasing.
Yeah, hang on. That is 1%. You're right. Going up. It's not that much, but anyway, 1% above inflation. But not every area in government spending is going to get that increase because we have these unprotected departments. And those are the areas that are not guaranteed those increases. And they've already had cuts. Local government, Home Office and Justice. Where are the cuts going to fall? People will want to know.
I think it's really important when local government, the amount of money they're getting up next year will go up by 7.5%. That is not them being cut. Their money is going up significantly. We just put an extra £600 million into local government. But also, I just want to emphasise, over this Parliament, we've increased the overall spending on resource by 2.3%, right? So it's gone up over this Parliament. It's going to go up over the next Parliament. But what we're doing is making sure that we are, and the Chancellor made this clear in his speech today, that we're spending this money very productively. So we announced a civil service kind of productivity plan today, which is putting money in, making investments in areas we know are expenses, we know are driving up council costs, for example, children's homes, special educational needs, schools, all those things. They will help save money and make sure that we are spending taxpayers' money more efficiently, because it's not just about what you put in, it's about what you get out.
But there will be tens of billions of pounds of cuts to unprotected areas.
Well, that depends on a spending review, which we are not doing.
Faisal?
The strategy of the Conservative Party since 2010 was to take people out of the tax system. You just put them all back in again now, with millions more in the tax system, 3 or 4 million now more dragged into the high rate tax band, creates all sorts of problems with red tape. And you've taken that tax money, which was far bigger than you anticipated when the freeze came in, and now you want some credit for giving about a third of it back.
Because the economy has been doing well, and because of that, the tax take has increased, and that has also meant that, and because of inflation falling, the debt interest payments also gone down, so that's increased. So that has allowed us, a little more headroom as well. But what we have done, as I've said, is make sure that where we can and where it's responsible to do so, we start the process of cutting people's taxes again. This is not the end of the story.
Why not just stop the freeze that's happening for the next 3 years rather than seek some great credit?
This is not the end of the story. We're doing things where it's fiscally responsible to do so. We're also doing things that aren't inflationary. You'll know that it's very important that this national insurance cut isn't inflationary. And overall, the OBR says that these package of measures will reduce inflation next year by 0.2%.
You're now running the public finances very hot. The headroom is now just below nine billion, just a few billion. Just a tiny move in the forecasts could wipe that out. Are you going to be the Chief Secretary writing the letter saying there's no money left to your successor?
Well, just to be clear, public sector net borrowing by the end of the forecast will be at a low which is historic for the last couple of decades, right? It'll be just over 1%. That is with a large degree of headroom on the borrowing figure. So
not on the debt one, though.
But not on the debt one, you're right. It's £9 billion on the debt one. But it is... We are being very responsible with this, right? We have managed to cut people's national insurance without increasing borrowing over the period from the autumn statement to 28-29. We are doing this in a very fiscally responsible way.
Can I talk about debt? Because shortly after becoming Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak gave a big speech where he said his government was going to deliver 5 key pledges, and one of them was on debt. We will make sure our national debt is falling so that we can secure the future of public services. Are you meeting that pledge?
So in the 5th year of the forecast, public sector net debt, excluding Bank of England, is due to fall from the 4th year. Public sector net debt overall is coming down.
Right, but that was your fiscal rule,
Yep.
that in the 5th year,
Yep.
debt would come down slightly from year 4. We've discussed that is a self-imposed, what the IFS call a very odd rule. In fact, we can see it here. In fact, it's going down from 93.2% to 92.9%. So, yes, you are meeting that fiscal rule. But I'm talking about the Prime Minister's pledge to make sure that national debt is falling. Is debt going to be higher or lower in 5 years' time than it is now?
So that is one measure. You've got it up on the screen.
Yeah, but answer that question. Is it going to be higher or lower?
That's public sector net debt, excluding the Bank of England. Public sector net debt, which is the overall figure, is coming down.
Right, but when people hear a pledge that says debt is going to be falling, you can assume they think debt is falling now.
Yep. Like I said, we are keeping within our fiscal rules. We're making sure borrowing has come down significantly, which is obviously a contributor to debt. By 28-29, it will be 1%, which is going to be a low for a couple of decades. So we are doing this in a very responsible way. And as I said, we're taking steps. And there are a couple of revenue raises in there today. This is not, we've really been clear that
tax
very
on vapes and
open and honest that we
break.
are asking those with the broader shoulders to take the burden while we cut taxes for working people.
Right, just to go back to debt, is debt falling?
It's going up on this measure for the next 3 or 4 years. And then, as we have repeatedly described, it then sort of tails off at the end.
Right, but when you hear a pledge from the Prime Minister, which says, I am committing this government to national debt falling, they're not going to meet that pledge going into the election.
It's a little bit like the difference between the pledge and what the actual fiscal rule is. There was some degree of vagueness. We saw that on some of the other Prime Ministers' promises, and that's the sort of gap here.
Is the fiscal rule really sensible?
You've got to have fiscal rules. I think that is the first thing. There are some people that don't believe in fiscal rules. Everyone at home would recognise that you have to stay within a budget. There is a lot. Fiscal rules have been, in place by numerous governments of all colours over many, many years. They are absolutely vital to ensure that the government is spending taxpayers' money wisely. This is not the only fiscal rule. There's also one on borrowing. Both have to bite and they interplay with each other.
Right, but you can't compare. Sorry.
It's like you don't trust yourselves. I mean, you only need the fiscal rule because you're saying, well, we can't be trusted to stick to something sensible in the first place.
I think there needs to be a yardstick by which the British public can judge how we're doing, and that is overseen by the independent OBR, and I think that's the right way of doing things.
Right, but I mean, government finances are not the same as household finances per se, and the rule self-imposed, made by the Chancellor, is he really sticking to the spirit of the fiscal rule?
Yes, absolutely.
Faisal?
I guess there's a sort of wider question here about, you're going to face the electorate at some point this year. I guess you're not going to take up the invitation of the opposition leader to confirm May, but there's a concern in the public about your party. There's been a change of prime ministers, there's been 5 different chancellors. If they vote for this plan, your plan, lower national insurance eventually, who are they actually going to get as Prime Minister and Chancellor? And what plan are they going to stick to? Are they going to do another sort of Liz Truss mini budget when the members get annoyed with who if you win the election?
They will get Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, who have turned the economy around.
Okay, I'm fucking done. I can only take so much of this fucking shit and I have to explode. I don't care. I'm sorry. I apologise. Fucking shut up, lady. About houses. And we all know that you have to live with a budget. Stop saying people stupid shit. Stop it. Please, for the love of God, you wonder why people are fucking idiots. If you say idiotic shit and it's on a news channel, you're supposed to believe what they're saying is actually fucking true. It isn't. There's no fucking any way of anyone's fucking brain. A house you live in is not the same as a fucking country with its own credit card, you fucking moron. You utter fucking deceitful fucking bitch. Fucking crackhead. Honestly, and people believe what she's saying. Oh yeah, my house is like a fucking country. It's not. We print our own money, you fucking bitch. Get a clue and stop lying to people on a fucking news channel. It's literally called fucking news. And they're giving you the fucking wrong information about very fucking basic shit. You fucking cunt. Ugh.
They've turned the economy around.
Fucking cunts,
because
honestly.
we stuck to a plan, things are really improving on inflation, on real wages, real household disposable incomes. These are all incredibly positive, and it's why it's so important that we stick to the plan rather than go back to square one with Labour.
Tricky to say it's...
Fuck off. Why do these people occupy my mind? Go back to square one with fucking Labour. Really? What, like no food banks, you fucking cunts, where people actually have fucking money to spend, and we went in a fucking recession? You fucking gobshites, you've been in power for 14 fucking years. Your incompetence is fucking showing right now. Well, let's cut taxes for the rich. That didn't work before, it ain't gonna work now. You fucking mongs. You fucking Stone Age fucking cunts. Get the fuck off my fucking brain. Go away. I told you I stream propaganda. These fucking people are fucking